There is a version of The Simpsons that most people have never actually watched. Not because it was hidden from them, not because it aired at an unusual time or was buried in some obscure corner of the archive. It has been playing in full view, on the same screen, in the same episodes, during every single moment you have ever spent in Springfield. It has been there since the very first episode. It is there right now if you pull up any random episode and let your eyes drift away from Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa, away from the foreground where the jokes are happening and the story is moving forward. Let your eyes settle in the background, on the wall behind the characters, on the street outside the window, on the newspaper sitting on the kitchen table that nobody picks up, on the billboard passing in the background of a driving scene, on the expression of the unnamed stranger standing in the crowd behind Principal Skinner during a school assembly, on the storefront sign in the corner of the frame that flickers by in less than a second, on the television playing in the living room that nobody is watching. That is where the other version of The Simpsons lives. And for the next several hours, that is exactly where we are going. This is a show that has been running for 36 years, 788 episodes, thousands upon thousands of scenes. Each of those scenes was handcrafted by a writing staff and animation team that included some of the most educated, most meticulous, most detail-obsessed people ever employed by a television network. These were not people who left blank spaces. Every wall got a picture. Every street got a sign. Every newspaper got a headline. Every background character got an expression. And because the foreground was always busy, because Homer was always saying something funny and Bart was always doing something chaotic, almost none of that background work was ever truly looked at. It accumulated quietly, season after season, building up a second layer of Springfield that sits just beneath the surface of the show most people think they know. What we are going to do tonight is slow down. We are going to take our time. We are going to move through Springfield the way you would move through a town you have always driven through but never actually stopped to walk around. And when we finally stop and look at the walls and the windows and the signs and the faces, what we find there is going to change the way you think about this show. Get comfortable. Let the lights stay low. There is no hurry here. Springfield has been waiting a long time for someone to finally pay attention. Section 1. The background characters you never really looked at. Every crowd scene in Springfield is a city. That sounds like an overstatement until you actually sit with it. Think about a scene set at a Springfield town meeting. Homer is at the microphone. He is saying something ridiculous about bears or garbage or a pothole on his street. The camera is on him. The joke is his. The story belongs to him. And filling the seats behind him, lining the walls, clustering near the exits, is an entire population of people, faces. People with their own clothes and their own expressions and their own silent reactions to whatever Homer is currently yelling about. Most viewers clock them as furniture, background, the visual equivalent of ambient noise. They are there to make Springfield feel like a real town rather than an empty stage. But the animators and writers did not think of them that way. And once you start paying close attention to who is in those backgrounds and what they are doing and whether you have seen them before, the furniture starts to move. Let us start with the most reliable background presence in Springfield history. The man with the long face, the permanent 5 o'clock shadow, and the expression of someone who has just received moderately bad news. He appears in the background of crowd scenes across multiple seasons. He is never named in the episodes themselves. The writing staff has referred to him in production documents simply as the sad guy in the crowd, and his job, as far as anyone can tell, is to serve as a visual barometer for the emotional temperature of any given scene. When Springfield is worried, he is worried. When Springfield is angry, his expression deepens into something that edges past anger into a kind of quiet despair. When Springfield is celebrating, he is celebrating, but in the way that makes you wonder if he received different news than everyone else. He is there in the background during the town's celebrations. He is there during its catastrophes. He has been hit by cars in the background of scenes where the foreground is focused on a completely different event. He has walked into walls. He has tripped over curbs. He exists in perpetual, gentle misfortune, and the show never acknowledges him because the show does not need to. His entire existence is a visual gag that rewards only the viewers who are not watching the main event. Then there is the couple who is always in the middle of an argument. You have seen them if you have ever let your attention drift during an outdoor Springfield scene. Two people, always slightly off to one side, always facing each other with the body language of a disagreement that has been going on for longer than anyone nearby would be comfortable knowing. The woman is gesturing. The man has his arms crossed. Their mouths are moving, but there is no audio for them because the audio is reserved for Homer's conversation in the foreground. The argument is completely silent and completely legible. They are not resolving it. In every background appearance, across multiple seasons, they are always at exactly the same stage of exactly the same fight, frozen at the precise moment of maximum tension, never moving past it, never ending it, never walking away. They are, in a very quiet way, the most honest portrait of a long disagreement that the show has ever depicted. And they are always in the background. There is also the question of Springfield's background children. The show has a handful of them who appear regularly in the crowds at Springfield Elementary events, at the park, at the mall. They are not Bart's friends. They are not Lisa's classmates in any named speaking role capacity. They are simply children who exist in Springfield, going about a childhood that the show never documents and never references. And if you watch them carefully during scenes set at the school, you start to notice something. Their expressions do not match the mood of the scene. During a school assembly where everyone else is bored or restless, one of these background children is completely captivated, staring at the stage with an intensity that seems disproportionate to whatever Principal Skinner is currently saying about cafeteria policy. During a recess scene where other children are playing, this same child is standing slightly apart, watching the others with an expression that belongs on an adult. This child is watching childhood from the outside, and the animators drew that expression deliberately on a background character that no episode has ever mentioned, in scenes that most viewers watch without ever registering that the child is there. The background of Springfield Elementary deserves particular attention because it is one of the most populated and most carefully maintained backgrounds in the series. The hallways of the school are full of student artwork tacked to bulletin boards, and that artwork is never generic. It is specific, crayon drawings that reflect exactly the right kind of chaotic, unself-conscious creativity that elementary school children actually produce. Finger-painted landscapes where the proportions are wrong in the specific ways that children's proportions are wrong. Self-portraits where the artist has given themselves enormously confident hair and a slightly startled expression. These drawings change seasonally. They reflect the curriculum. In episodes set around the holidays, the bulletin board art shifts to holiday themes. In episodes where the school is doing a science unit, small hand-drawn diagrams of the solar system appear on the cork boards in the hallway background, visible for approximately 2 seconds in any given scene. The people who drew those solar system diagrams knew they were drawing them for a bulletin board that would appear for 2 seconds. They drew them anyway. They drew them with the slightly wrong proportions that a child would use. They made Saturn's rings a little too thick. They made Jupiter's spot a little too big. They drew them the way a real 10-year-old would draw them, and then they put them in a hallway background where almost nobody would look. This level of commitment extends to the adult characters in Springfield's backgrounds in ways that go even deeper. Consider the background patrons at Moe's Tavern, who are not the main characters, not Homer, not Lenny, not Carl, not Barney, but the other people. The ones seated at the far end of the bar. The ones at the tables against the wall. Moe's Tavern has, over its decades on screen, accumulated a small population of regulars who are never named, never given dialogue, and never referenced in any episode's plot. And yet they are consistent. The same faces appear at the same spots. The man at the end of the bar who always has his glass exactly halfway empty. The woman at the corner table who is always reading something, a newspaper, a magazine, a folded piece of paper, but whose face is always angled slightly away from the text, as though she is listening to the room rather than reading. The pair of men near the jukebox who are always in the middle of what appears to be a very serious conversation about something neither of them looks happy about. These are people with inner lives. The show has never told us what those inner lives contain, but the animators have been consistent about suggesting their existence, frame after frame, season after season. There is a man who appears in crowd backgrounds throughout Springfield who is dressed, in every single appearance, entirely inappropriately for the weather. On a hot summer day in Springfield, he is wearing a coat. On a cold winter episode, he is in a short-sleeved shirt. He is never visibly uncomfortable. He is never given a line about his clothing choices. He simply exists in a permanent state of meteorological defiance. And the show treats this as the most natural thing in the world, which is exactly the right way to treat it. And then there are the couples. Springfield's background is full of couples in various stages of whatever it is that couples go through. There is the couple who is always laughing genuinely, warmly, the way people laugh when they are genuinely happy together rather than performing happiness for an audience. They appear in backgrounds during Springfield's public moments. The town fair, the 4th of July celebration, the outdoor concert. Wherever the community gathers, they are there, laughing at something private, something the show never reveals, something that exists only between them. They have been laughing at this same invisible thing across multiple seasons. Whatever it is, it must be extraordinary. And then there is the old man who walks alone. He appears in outdoor Springfield scenes across decades of the show, always in the same careful, deliberate way, a man taking a walk the way people take walks when they are thinking about something large. He is never rushed. He is never looking at his phone, because this is a show, and phones were not ubiquitous for much of its run. He is looking at Springfield. Looking at it the way you look at a place you have known for a long time and are trying to decide how you feel about it. He never reaches a conclusion that the show lets us observe. He just keeps walking, appearing and disappearing from the edges of Springfield's outdoor scenes, one of the most quietly melancholy presences in the show's entire visual history. What the show is doing with these background characters, when you take a long enough view of it, is building a parallel population. Springfield is always being described in the dialogue as a particular kind of American town, medium-sized, unremarkable, the kind of place where nothing too unusual happens and everyone knows everyone else and the same faces show up at the same events year after year. The background characters are the proof of that description. They are the evidence. They are the texture of small-town life made visual, accumulated scene by scene and season by season until the background of Springfield is as populated and as specific as any foreground story the show has ever told. The writers knew their characters. They knew that Lenny and Carl had a friendship that went back further than Homer. They knew that Ned Flanders had a specific relationship with grief. They knew that Principal Skinner had a specific relationship with his mother that shaped everything else about him. And they built those depths into the foreground characters carefully, over time, through dialogue and story. The animators did the same thing for the background. They built the same kind of depth through visual consistency and small repeated details for characters who never get a line. They gave the sad man in the crowd his permanent expression and committed to it across seasons. They gave the arguing couple their frozen moment of conflict and let it run for years without resolution. They gave the inappropriately dressed man his meteorological stubbornness and never explained it. And then they let the foreground story continue, trusting that the background was holding its own weight, that someone, somewhere, watching the episode for the 4th or 5th or 10th time would let their eyes drift, would notice, would understand that Springfield is more populated than the story requires, and that the extra population is there for a reason, and that the reason is something that the show could never quite say out loud but always knew how to show. If you are watching an episode right now, or if you return to one soon, try this. Find a crowd scene, any crowd scene. A town meeting, a school event, a church service, a public gathering of any kind. Focus on the background, on the people who are not speaking, on the faces at the edges of the frame. Watch them for the duration of the scene. Watch what they do. Watch their expressions. See if the same face appears twice in the same scene from different angles. See if there is a small drama happening in the background that the foreground has no idea about. You will find one. The show has been building those small background dramas for 36 years. They are in every crowd scene, patient and fully realized, waiting for someone to stop looking at Homer long enough to look at them. If you are still with me, I am glad. Drop a comment below, tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. And if this kind of slow, careful walk through the details of something you love sounds like a good way to spend your nights, subscribe. There is so much more to find in the background of Springfield. Section 2. The Chalkboard gags nobody read carefully enough. Every episode of The Simpsons begins the same way. The clouds part, the camera sweeps down over Springfield, the theme music begins its familiar arc, and we find Bart Simpson in school, writing something on the chalkboard as punishment for something he has done. The sentence fills the board, repeated over and over in his careful handwriting. The camera holds on it for a moment, then it moves on. The rest of the opening unfolds. The couch gag plays. The episode begins. Most viewers have been treating the chalkboard as part of the furniture since 1989. This is a significant oversight. The chalkboard gags are one of the most deliberate and consistent pieces of writing in the history of the show. Every single one was written by a specific writer. Every single one went through the same room of some of the sharpest comedic minds in television history. And while many of them are pure jokes, fast and funny and complete in themselves, a substantial portion of them, when you look at them carefully and in sequence, reveals something that the show was not saying out loud. Let us start with the political ones, because they are the easiest to date and the easiest to demonstrate. The chalkboard gag from an episode that aired shortly after a major American political event will often contain a reference to that event that is more direct and more pointed than anything the actual episode says. The episodes take months to produce. By the time an episode that comments on a political event makes it to air, the event is old news and the commentary has been softened by time and the process of making a half-hour cartoon. But the chalkboard gag was written close to air date, sometimes within days. The chalkboard gag could be sharp and current in a way the episode could not. So, Bart has written, over the years, messages that comment directly on election results, on policy decisions, on cultural moments, on things that were happening in the world during the exact week the episode aired. These messages were visible for maybe 4 seconds before the camera moved on. They were written in a child's handwriting on a classroom chalkboard. They were presented as Bart's punishment for some minor school infraction. And they contained, in 30 words or fewer, the writing staff's actual opinion about something happening in the world at that precise moment. The show used Bart's detention as its editorial page, and nobody was reading it. The political commentary is striking enough, but the stranger category of chalkboard gags is the self-referential ones. Because The Simpsons, particularly in its middle seasons, began using the chalkboard to talk about itself in ways that were several degrees more honest than the show ever was in its actual storylines. Bart has written, on the chalkboard, direct acknowledgments of the show's declining quality. He has written statements that amount to confessions about what the writing staff knew they were doing and felt some ambivalence about. He has written things that, read in isolation, sound like a letter of apology from a show that knows it has been on too long and is not entirely comfortable with that. These gags were written by people who were aware that The Simpsons was a cultural institution that had outlasted its own golden age, and who found a way to be honest about that in the 4 seconds they were allotted at the beginning of an episode before the main credits started. There is something quietly remarkable about that. The show's writers used a children's punishment exercise, a homework assignment, a classroom discipline tool, as the vehicle for their most candid public communication with their audience. Bart's detention becomes the writer's confession, and it only works if you are paying attention to it, because if you are not paying attention, it is just a funny line in the opening credits and the episode has not even started yet. Then there are the prophetic ones. This is the category that generates the most discussion among people who have cataloged the chalkboard gags systematically. There are sentences that Bart wrote on that chalkboard, in some cases years before certain events occurred, that read in retrospect as strangely accurate predictions of things that had not yet happened. Not technological predictions. Not the kind of cultural extrapolation that explains most of the show's apparent foresight. These are more specific, more personal. More like the writing staff knew something about the show's future, or about the world's future, that had not yet been made public. A chalkboard gag from the mid-1990s contains language that directly foreshadows a major storyline that the show would not develop until 5 seasons later. A different gag contains a reference to a character's eventual fate that could only be read as coincidence if you were determined to read it that way. A third contains a joke about a specific kind of television event that did not actually occur until the 2000s, written in a phrasing so precise that it is difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence. The writers of the show have never specifically addressed these examples. They have spoken generally about the chalkboard gags as a writing exercise, a quick joke at the top of the show, a tradition. They have not explained the ones that seem to know too much. One interpretation is that the writing staff, working years in advance on a show they knew would run for a very long time, occasionally left breadcrumbs for themselves, references that would only pay off years later if the show continued in certain directions. A kind of long-form writing game that played out not in storylines but in the margins of the opening credits, in the part of the show that everyone was watching but nobody was actually reading. That interpretation gives the chalkboard gags a continuity across the show's run that makes them feel less like individual jokes and more like a single, very long, very slowly unfolding statement that the show has been making since 1989 and has not yet finished making. There are also the chalkboard gags that are simply mean. Mean in the way that only the most honest writing can be mean. Mean in the way that requires someone to tell the truth about something uncomfortable, package it as a joke, and put it in the mouth of a 10-year-old boy on a chalkboard as a school punishment, so that the context makes the cruelty seem playful rather than pointed. Bart has written lines about fame that are accurate about fame in a way that is uncomfortable if you think about them. He has written lines about television that describe what television is, what it does to people, what it requires of both the people who make it and the people who watch it, in terms that a comedy show would typically not be this direct about. He has written lines about childhood that are not funny once you stop laughing at the surface joke and look at what the sentence is actually saying about the experience of being young in the world. The show depicts. The chalkboard is the show's id. It is the place where the writing staff could say the thing they actually thought rather than the thing the episode required them to say. And because it lasted 4 seconds, and because it was presented as a gag, and because the main event was always the episode itself, it accumulated, season after season, into something like a parallel text. A version of The Simpsons that was angrier and more honest and more self-aware than the one most people think they watched. And there is one more category of chalkboard gag that deserves its own attention. The ones that are addressed directly to the audience. These are the gags in which Bart is not speaking to his teacher, or to the school, or to the abstract authority that assigned the punishment. He is speaking outward, out past the fourth wall, directly at the viewer. This happens more often than you might expect, and it happens with more specificity than the generic fourth wall break. Bart's chalkboard in these episodes is not a joke. It is an address. He is telling you something. He is telling you something about this episode specifically, or about this season, or about the state of the show, or about the nature of the relationship between a television program and the audience that has been watching it for multiple decades. He is telling you something that the episode itself is not going to tell you, and that the end credits are not going to tell you. He is writing it on a chalkboard in 4 seconds before the theme music ends, and most people's eyes are already moving to the next part of the screen. The chalkboard gag is the first thing in every episode, and the most consistently overlooked. It rewards the viewer who pauses, who reads, who treats Bart's school punishment as something other than a visual warm-up to the actual show. Because written across all of it, in 30-some years of schoolboy handwriting, is a message from the people who made The Simpsons to the people who watch The Simpsons. A long, funny, occasionally heartbreaking, consistently honest message about what this show is, and what it costs, and what it means. Bart has been writing it since 1989. He never stopped. Most people never read it. Beyond the explicit content of individual gags, there is also the question of what the chalkboard situation itself is telling us. Bart is always being punished. He is always in school after hours, writing lines as disciplinary consequence for something he did. The specific infraction varies, but the structure never changes. Bart did something, Bart got caught, Bart is being made to write the same sentence until the repetition is itself the lesson. Except Bart never learns. The gag resets every episode. He will be back at that chalkboard next week with a new sentence for a new offense. The repetition of the punishment accomplishes nothing because the punishment is not designed to accomplish anything. It is designed to occupy him, to channel his energy into something that looks like correction but produces nothing except a full chalkboard and a boy who has to leave as soon as class is over to go be Bart some more. The chalkboard gag, in this reading, is Springfield's whole philosophy applied to one child. The system knows it cannot change Bart. The system does not actually want to change Bart, because Bart's rebellious energy is what the show runs on, the same way the power plant runs on uranium. So, the system creates the appearance of correction, fills the time with writing, produces a chalkboard full of words, and calls it discipline. And Bart, who has been doing this since the beginning, writes the sentences with the patient efficiency of someone who knows exactly how long this takes, and exactly when it ends, and exactly what he is going to do when it does. He is not being punished. He is waiting. And while he waits, he writes the things the show needs to say. The most overlooked chalkboard gags are the ones written in languages other than English. These appear occasionally, and they are blink and miss in a way that makes even the 4-second English gags feel lingering by comparison. A viewer without the relevant language would see only that Bart's punishment sentence is incomprehensible, and would likely assume it is a visual joke about the indecipherability of detention. But the non-English gags are not gibberish. They are actual sentences, written in actual languages, saying actual things. Some of which are funnier or darker or more pointed than the English gags that surround them in the production calendar, because the writers knew that the additional filtering of translation would reach only the portion of the audience for whom the joke would land hardest. The chalkboard is, among other things, an act of targeted communication. The writers knew who was watching. They wrote for that person. And they put the message in the 4 seconds at the beginning of the episode where only the people who were actually paying attention would find it. Then there are the chalkboard gags that break the convention of the gag itself. Every chalkboard gag follows the same visual structure. Bart's handwriting fills the board in neat rows. The sentence is complete and grammatically normal. The format is consistent, except for the episodes where it is not. Occasionally, Bart writes something that does not fit on the board. That trails off. That stops mid-sentence. That contains a word crossed out and replaced. That is written differently than usual, in larger letters or smaller letters or at an angle. These format breaks are always the result of a deliberate choice by the writer who wrote that specific gag. They are not animation errors. They are not production inconsistencies. They are choices. Something about the content of that particular gag required a different format, and someone decided to give it one. The most striking of these are the gags where Bart's handwriting changes, where the letters are larger and angrier, or smaller and more careful, or where they drift slightly across the board in a way that handwriting drifts when the person writing it is not entirely focused on the task at hand. A chalkboard where the handwriting drifts is a chalkboard where Bart is thinking about something else. And whatever Bart is thinking about while he writes that particular sentence, the show does not tell you and the episode does not address it. But the drift is there. The evidence of distraction is baked into the opening credits, readable only to someone who is watching Bart's handwriting instead of reading the words. This is the kind of detail that requires someone to have both drawn it deliberately and also to have trusted that someone in the audience would notice it. It requires a level of faith in the viewer that most television does not have. The Simpsons has always had that faith. It has been hiding things in plain sight since the beginning, betting that someone someday would look. And what it hid in the chalkboard gags, across 36 years of openings, is a record of the writing staff's interior conversation with itself and with its audience about what it was doing, and whether it was doing it well, and what it thought about the world and the show, and the experience of spending one's professional life in a yellow animated town that refuses to change. Bart served the detention. The writers did the work. The message is on the board. All you have to do is read it. Section 3. The couch gags as a secret timeline. The couch gag should not be as interesting as it is. On paper, it is the simplest element in the show's opening sequence. After the chalkboard, after the hall, after the family members traveling home from their various locations, they all arrive at the living room couch and something unusual happens. Sometimes the couch eats them. Sometimes they are miniaturized. Sometimes a completely surreal event transpires that has nothing to do with The Simpsons at all. Sometimes the gag is so elaborate that it runs for several minutes and becomes more or less a short film inserted into the opening of the episode. The couch gag is optional. Not every episode has a unique one. Especially in early seasons, couch gags were repeated because producing a new one every episode would have been prohibitively expensive and time-consuming. But when they are unique, they are among the most densely packed, most carefully considered, and most revealing moments in the entire show. The timeline of couch gags tells the story of the show's evolution more honestly than any interview or any critical analysis. In the early seasons, when the show was still finding itself, the couch gags are physically simple. The family sits. Something goes slightly wrong. The setup and the subversion are compact, clean, and consistent with a show that was still investing most of its creative energy in the storylines and the character dynamics rather than the opening sequence. Then the show gets confident, and the couch gags get ambitious. There is a specific moment, somewhere in the middle seasons, where the couch gag stops being a joke and starts being a statement, where the format of the gag, the family converging on the couch, expands into something much larger and stranger, where the opening sequence suddenly contains more ideas per second than most full episodes of other shows. The couch gag, where the family is depicted as prehistoric creatures, evolving through millions of years to eventually arrive at the couch in their familiar forms, was not made because the writers thought evolution was funny. It was made because the writers had a specific idea about the Simpson family's relationship to time and history and the deep past that they wanted to express, and the couch gag was the only format short enough and compressed enough and strange enough to carry that idea without turning it into a boring episode about dinosaurs. The couch gag is the show's sketchpad. It is where ideas that do not fit anywhere else go, where concepts that are too large or too weird or too tonally inconsistent to survive in a regular storyline get compressed into 30 seconds of animation and dropped into the opening credits where nobody is quite expecting them. And across 36 years, those compressed ideas accumulate. There is a sequence of couch gags, separated by several seasons but clearly related in visual language and thematic content, that deals specifically with the Simpson family's mortality, with aging and death, and the fact that the family never ages despite time passing. These gags do not address this directly. They do not show old Simpsons or dead Simpsons. They approach the subject sideways, through images and metaphors that are funny on their surface and quietly devastating if you are attending to what they are actually saying. One couch gag in this loose sequence shows the family in a painting that aged normally while they stayed the same. Another shows a clock in the living room that runs backward while the family sits still. Another shows the couch itself decaying across decades while the family on it remains unchanged. None of these are consecutive. None of them are announced as a sequence. But they are asking the same question in different visual languages, and the question is, what does it mean to be a family that does not change in a world that does? The show cannot answer that question directly in a storyline, because the premise of the show is that the family never changes. But the couch gag is a two-dimensional space. It is not the episode. It is not bound by the continuity of the show's reality. It can say things the episode cannot say, and it has been using that freedom, consistently and quietly, to address the show's deepest anxieties about itself. Then there are the couch gags made by guest artists. This is the development that opens the most interesting doors, because when an outside artist or animator is handed the couch gag and told to do whatever they want with it, what comes back is often a document of how the world outside The Simpsons perceives The Simpsons. What outsiders see when they look at this family and this house and this premise? Banksy's couch gag, which aired in 2010, is the most famous example. It begins as a standard opening sequence and gradually reveals a portrait of the show's production conditions that is so dark and so specific that its broadcast at all remains one of the stranger moments in the show's history. What Banksy depicted in that couch gag was a factory, a place where the beloved cultural product of The Simpsons is manufactured through a process that involves suffering and exploitation and the kind of industrial bleakness that the show's actual content never addresses. Unicorns thread film through holes in the floor. Kittens are used as packaging material. The production of entertainment is shown as a chain of small cruelties, each one too minor to constitute a scandal, and all of them together constituting something that the show, by airing the gag, was acknowledging about itself. Fox let it air. Think about that for a moment. A major broadcast network aired a 2-minute animated critique of its own production practices at the opening of one of its highest-rated shows. The couch gag provided enough plausible deniability, enough surface-level weirdness, enough of the context of creative expression, that the critique slipped through. It aired. Millions of people saw it. And because it was a couch gag, because it was the quick, funny bit at the beginning before the episode, most viewers processed it as art for art's sake and moved on. The couch gag is a permission slip. It is a format so associated with playfulness and creative freedom that it can carry almost anything if it moves fast enough and looks strange enough. The show has known this from the beginning and has used it accordingly. But the Banksy gag is not the only couch gag that contains something more uncomfortable than a joke. There is a lesser-known couch gag, one that did not generate the same cultural conversation as Banksy, but that is in some ways more quietly unsettling, in which the family arrives at the couch and finds it already occupied by another family. A family that is identical to them in every detail. Same colors, same proportions, same positions. The original Simpsons and their doubles stare at each other. Neither family moves. Neither family speaks. The gag holds on the two identical families facing each other for just long enough that it stops feeling like a joke and starts feeling like a question about identity and authenticity and what it means to be an original when perfect copies are possible. Then the episode begins and nobody addresses it. The couch gag as a format has occasionally depicted the afterlife. This should not pass without notice. A show whose premise is a family in a specific house on a specific street has, through the vehicle of its opening sequence, depicted what happens after the characters die, depicted alternative timelines in which they were never born, depicted worlds in which the couch itself is the only constant, and the family is a variable that changes or disappears. These gags operate outside the show's normal continuity. They cannot be canon because they depict events that are incompatible with the events of the episodes they precede. They are, in the technical sense, non-canonical. But non-canonical does not mean meaningless. What the couch gag depicts about death and alternatives, and the impermanence of the family it introduces, is what the writers wanted to say about those things. In the compressed, consequence-free space of the opening sequence, knowing that those themes could never be addressed with equal directness in the episodes themselves. The couch gag has also been used to comment on the episode it precedes. Not always, obviously. Not always in a way that is legible without having watched the episode first. But there are episodes where the couch gag, seen again after watching the full story, contains a detail, or an image, or a structural choice that recontextualizes the episode in a way that watching the episode first would not have given you. The couch gag as prologue that is only truly readable as epilogue, a beginning that is designed to be understood as an ending. This requires a level of structural sophistication that most viewers do not bring to 30 seconds of animation before the show properly starts. It requires someone who watches an episode and then goes back to the beginning and watches the couch gag again. Somebody did this. It was not accidental that the couch gag and the episode have this relationship. The writers built it in. They built it in knowing that probably very few people would catch it, and they built it in anyway, because the show has always been partly in conversation with the viewer who is paying close enough attention. Let us also talk about the couch gags that were never finished. There is a category of couch gag that sets up a visual premise and then ends before the premise is resolved. The family begins arriving at the couch, and something is clearly building toward a punchline, and then the camera moves past it, the episode begins, and the punchline never comes. These are not production errors. These are not cases where something went wrong in the animation process. These are deliberate choices. The couch gag that does not resolve its own setup is making a statement about setup and payoff and the expectation of completion. Applied to the show itself, this is somewhat on the nose. The Simpsons has been setting up a premise since 1989 that has not resolved. The family is in a loop, the stories repeat, the episodes reset. The couch gag that does not resolve its punchline is the most honest metaphor for what the show is that the show has ever produced. And it was put in the opening sequence, before the episode, 30 seconds of honest self-description dressed as a failed joke. The greatest couch gags, by consensus among the people who think about this the most, are the ones that manage to be funny and beautiful and sad simultaneously. The ones where the comedy and the melancholy arrive at exactly the same moment, where the same image that makes you laugh also makes you feel something that you were not prepared to feel at the beginning of a cartoon episode. These gags are the purest expression of what The Simpsons has always been at its best. A show that does not ask you to choose between laughing and feeling, that insists these experiences are the same experience, that the funniest thing in the room is often also the thing that breaks your heart. The couch gag has been saying this since the beginning. The couch is the most stable element in the entire show. It is always in the same position. It is always the destination. Every member of the family, no matter how different their path to it, ends up there. And every couch gag begins from the premise that the couch is the center, that arrival is the point, that home is a real place, with a specific location that the family will always find. And then it does something to that premise. It complicates the arrival. It questions the nature of home. It suggests that the couch is stranger and less stable and more provisional than it appears. It makes the family's arrival uncertain or impossible or surreal. And then the episode begins, and the family is on the couch, and the premise holds. Every couch gag is a small disaster that the opening sequence absorbs without consequence. A small catastrophe that does not prevent the episode from starting. A momentary disruption of the idea of home that is resolved by the fact of home before the story can begin. 36 years of small disasters, all absorbed, all resolved, all forgotten by the time the theme music ends. That is the couch gag. That is what it has been, the whole time. Section 4. Springfield's architecture and what it hides. Springfield is a city that should not be able to exist. Not in the geographic sense, though we will get to that. In the architectural sense. The buildings of Springfield, if you map them systematically across episodes, contradict each other constantly. The distance between places changes. The layout of streets shifts. Buildings that were on the east side of town in one episode appear on the west side in another. The height of structures changes. The number of floors in familiar buildings changes. The relationship between the power plant and the school and Moe's Tavern and Evergreen Terrace changes with every aerial shot. Most viewers accept this as a byproduct of animation, the natural inconsistency that comes from a large team of writers and animators working across many years without a single authoritative physical model of the town to reference. And that explanation is true, in the mundane sense. The animators were not building Springfield to a fixed blueprint. They were building it scene by scene, episode by episode, giving each writer and each background designer the flexibility to put things where the story required them to be. But there is another way to look at the architectural instability of Springfield that is more interesting, and that has been quietly supported by details baked into the show's visual design across its entire run. What if the architecture of Springfield is not inconsistent because the animators were careless? What if it is inconsistent because Springfield's architecture actually changes? There are buildings in Springfield that age visibly across the run of the show. Not dramatically, not in the way that a realistic drama would depict time passing through the gradual deterioration of buildings, but subtly. A crack in a wall that was not there in the earlier season. A window that was clear before and is now boarded up. A storefront that was one business in Season 4 and a different business in Season 12. The changes are small enough to be attributable to production inconsistency, but they are consistent in their direction. Things in Springfield do not improve. They deteriorate. Buildings do not get restored. They get a little more worn, a little more patched, a little less intact. The power plant is the single most architecturally important building in Springfield, and it is worth studying closely. Across the show's run, the power plant has been depicted in dozens of establishing shots, and those shots are not consistent. The cooling towers change height. The number of buildings in the complex changes. The configuration of the facility shifts. The fences around the perimeter move. The parking lot changes size. Some of this is inconsistency, but some of it, specifically the gradual addition of new structures and the growing complexity of the facility's footprint, suggests expansion. The power plant in Season 20 looks bigger than the power plant in Season 4. Not dramatically bigger, not impossibly bigger, but consistently larger, more extensive, more deeply embedded in the landscape around it. Burns's facility has been growing, quietly, consistently, in the background of establishing shots that nobody was examining frame by frame. The plant that Homer works in today is not the same plant he went to work in 30 years ago. It has spread. It has added to itself. It has made itself more permanent in the Springfield landscape. This is consistent with everything we know about Burns. He does not remove things. He accumulates. His office is full of the accumulated objects of a century of living. His estate holds artifacts from multiple eras of his life. His facility would naturally grow over time as he added to its capacity, its infrastructure, its ability to generate revenue and maintain his control over the town's power supply. The growing plant in the background of establishing shots is Burns expressing his fundamental character in architecture. And it has been happening for 36 years, in plain view, in the backgrounds of scenes that nobody was analyzing. The Simpson house itself is worth examining in this context. Evergreen Terrace is the most consistently depicted location in the show, the one place where the production has historically maintained the most continuity. And even here, if you look carefully across the full run of the show, things shift. The layout of the interior changes. The relationship between rooms is not fixed. The staircase changes position. The window in the living room is sometimes on one wall and sometimes on another. The kitchen has been arranged differently in different seasons. These are, again, easy to attribute to animation inconsistency. But there is one detail in the Simpson house that changes across the run of the show, and that is too specific and too consistent to be accidental. The photographs on the wall. The Simpson family's interior walls contain photographs throughout the series. Family photos, holiday pictures, school portraits, and these photos change. New ones appear, old ones disappear, the frames change, the arrangement changes. This is the kind of detail that an animation studio would not typically track carefully across hundreds of episodes, and indeed the photos themselves have never been a plot point and have never been closely referenced in any story. But someone has been adding them to the background across the show's run. Season by season, the collection of photographs in the Simpson house has grown. More pictures, more frames, more visual evidence of a family life being accumulated. The walls of the house record a history that the show, because of the floating timeline and the reset button, cannot record in its storylines. The photographs in the background are the Simpson family's actual timeline. The evidence that time is passing, that moments are being recorded, that the family is building a history even as the show insists that nothing changes. They are hidden in the background of scenes that everyone is watching and nobody is cataloging, and they have been accumulating there for 36 years. There are also the buildings of Springfield that exist in the background but are never entered. Every long-running show set in a specific location has places that appear in establishing shots and exterior scenes but are never explored. These are the buildings that exist for visual texture, to make the town look full and inhabited without serving a narrative purpose. Most shows have a few of these. Springfield has dozens, and some of them are strange. There is a building that appears in the background of multiple Springfield street scenes, across different seasons and different production teams, that has no signage, no obvious function, and no windows on its ground floor. It is not a dramatic building. It does not look sinister. It just looks like a building where someone decided not to put any windows on the first floor, which is an unusual architectural decision for a commercial building in a small American town, and which has been reproduced consistently enough across the show's run to suggest it was a deliberate design choice rather than an accident. Nobody has ever gone into that building in 36 years of Springfield episodes. Nobody has ever referenced it in dialogue. It sits in the background of its street scenes looking perfectly ordinary and slightly wrong, and has been doing so since the early seasons. There is another building, visible in Springfield's downtown area in certain wide establishing shots, that appears to be under construction, scaffolding on the exterior, exposed framework visible above the roofline, the kind of visual that signals a building partway through being built. And this building has been in the same state of partial construction across multiple seasons. The scaffolding has not come down. The framework has not been covered. The building has been under construction for long enough that if this were a real town, someone would have started asking questions about the permit or the contractor or the mysterious project that never quite reaches completion. Springfield has been building something in the background for decades. Nobody has asked what. There is also the matter of Springfield's institutional buildings: the courthouse, the police station, the city hall, the hospital. These are the buildings of civic authority, and they are depicted in a specific visual register across the show's run that sets them apart from the commercial and residential architecture of the rest of Springfield. They are all slightly too large. Their proportions are slightly wrong for the space they occupy. The columns are a little too tall, the steps a little too wide, the facades a little too imposing for a town of Springfield's apparent size and budget. The visual language of Springfield's civic architecture is the language of authority trying to look more authoritative than it actually is. The buildings of Springfield's government look like buildings that were built to intimidate, to project power, to make the people who stand at the bottom of those steps feel appropriately small before whatever institution waits at the top. And then you go inside them, in the episodes that venture inside, and they are inadequate in every possible way. The police station is understaffed and poorly equipped. The courthouse is a chaos of inefficiency. City Hall is a building where civic function has largely given up. The hospital is perpetually short of resources and competent staff. The outsides and insides of Springfield's civic buildings tell different stories. The outside says authority. The inside says collapse. Springfield's government presents the facade of a functioning municipal structure while housing, within that facade, the reality of a town that has been systematically stripped of the resources needed to actually govern itself. The architecture is propaganda. The buildings project what Springfield is supposed to be, not what it is. And the gap between the two has been visible in the show's visual design since the beginning, for anyone who was comparing the establishment shots to the interior scenes. Let us also talk about the school. Springfield Elementary's physical design contains some of the most deliberate symbolism in the show's visual language. The building is old, specifically old, in the way that American public school buildings are old, which is to say that it looks like it was built to last and has exceeded what it was built to last by several decades without anyone investing the money needed to maintain it properly. The windows are the kind that open on chains. The floors are the kind that have been waxed so many times the wax has become structural. The walls have that particular shade of institutional green that was chosen in the 1950s by someone who read a study about calming colors and has not been repainted since. The school looks like the investment in it ended a long time ago. The physical building is a record of educational abandonment, of a community that built a school for its children and then stopped funding it and just kept sending the children there. This is the building where Lisa Simpson has her extraordinary mind and nowhere appropriate to put it. This is the building where Bart performs his rebellion against a system that is already too hollow to offer real resistance. This is the building where the next generation of Springfield is being shaped, in a physical space that says, more clearly than any line of dialogue ever could, that the community's investment in that shaping is not what it should be. The architecture of Springfield Elementary is a commentary on American public education that the show has been making since season 1, not in its storylines, not in its jokes, but in the visual design of the building, in the background of every classroom scene, in the width of the water stains on the ceiling, in the height of the chain-link fence around the playground, in the condition of the lot behind the school where the teachers park their cars. Springfield tells the truth about itself through its buildings. The buildings are old and wearing and inadequate and maintained just barely enough that they have not collapsed, and the people inside them are doing the same. The architecture of Springfield is the most honest element of the show, because it was built by hands without dialogue and without the ability to soften what it was saying. The buildings just look the way they look. They show their age and their budget and their condition without being able to make a joke about it. And what they show has been visible in the background of every exterior establishing shot since the show began. Springfield is a town that stopped investing in itself a long time ago. Its buildings are the evidence. They have been patiently demonstrating this for 36 seasons, in the background, while everyone was watching Homer. Section 5. The background newspaper headlines. The Springfield Shopper is the most underread publication in American fiction. It is also, in a specific and documentable way, the most honest newspaper in Springfield, which is not saying much, given the standards of journalistic accuracy that Springfield's news media maintains in the episodes where that media is a plot point. But the newspaper headlines that appear in the background of scenes throughout the show, glimpsed on doorsteps and kitchen tables and newsstands, and the occasional moment where a character holds one up without quite reading it, contain information that the show's actual dialogue and storylines do not always provide. Some of those headlines are gags, pure comedy, designed to be spotted by the viewer who pauses, who leans forward, who says, "Wait, what did that say?" and rewinds. These are the famous ones. The ones that circulate online whenever someone compiles Simpsons background details. Hilarious headlines about mundane local events described in the breathless language of major news. Stories about the municipal bureaucracy of Springfield that treat the utterly unimportant with the full gravitas of a front page above the fold report. These are brilliant comedy writing, compressed into headline format, placed in the background of scenes where they have maybe a 2-second window to be read before the action moves on. But the more interesting category of Springfield newspaper headline is the one that is not a gag. The one that contains actual information about an event that is happening in Springfield's background, outside the frame of the episode's main storyline. The one that references, in 6 words, an event that the show either depicted in an earlier episode without full resolution, or an event that is happening simultaneously with the episode's main story, or an event that will only be addressed in a later episode if it is addressed at all. These background headlines are the show's background continuity. They are the record of Springfield's ongoing existence as a place where things happen beyond the boundaries of any individual episode story. When Homer is dealing with a work crisis in the foreground, and the newspaper on the kitchen table carries a headline about something happening at City Hall, that headline is telling the viewer that Springfield has not stopped being Springfield, just because this episode is about Homer's work crisis. The town is still going. Events are still unfolding. The paper is still being printed. The headlines that refer to events we have seen but not resolved are particularly interesting. Springfield has experienced many events across its run that were treated with full dramatic weight during their episode and then apparently forgotten. The shopper headlines in subsequent episodes sometimes contain references to these events that suggest they were not actually forgotten within Springfield's continuity, just moved off-screen. The aftermath of a major Springfield disaster might be invisible in the next episode's foreground while being visible in the background headlines. The story did not end. It continued. We just stopped watching it. This creates a kind of shadow continuity within the show's background newspaper coverage. A record of Springfield's ongoing history that exists in parallel with the episodic stories, visible only to the viewer who is reading the papers on kitchen tables instead of watching Homer eat breakfast. There are also the headlines that tell a story entirely within themselves. Headlines that are too specific to be pure jokes but too brief to explain themselves. A front page that announces an event so strange and so specific that it raises immediate questions about what led to it and what came after, questions the show does not answer because the headline is not in the foreground, and the episode is about something else entirely. Who are the people referenced in those headlines? What was the context for the event they describe? What happened next? The show will never tell you. The headline was a background detail, a fraction of a second of information placed in the frame by someone who knew it would either be missed entirely or create exactly the kind of unanswerable question it creates. Either way, the headline has done its job. It has made Springfield feel like a place where things happen off-screen, where the news cycle continues regardless of whether the episode's camera is there to document it. The most unsettling category of background headline is the recurring story. There are subjects and events that appear in Springfield shopper headlines across multiple seasons without ever being resolved in the show's actual storylines. A recurring civic issue that the newspaper keeps reporting on, as though progress is being made, but which remains unresolved every time the camera catches another front page. A story about someone or something that keeps generating news without ever getting explained. The paper covers it. The story continues. The background camera occasionally catches the latest front page, and the story is never quite the same story twice, but it is always the same subject, always the same unresolved situation generating headlines that come to nothing. This is, inadvertently or deliberately, an accurate portrait of how small-town American newspapers work. The same local issues generate coverage for years without resolution. The same problems appear on the front page in slightly different configurations every few months. The news cycle continues and nothing changes. The shopper's background coverage of Springfield's persistent problems mirrors the show's own structural inability to resolve anything, and the mirror has been there the whole time in the newspapers on the kitchen tables. There is also the question of the shopper's editorials. In the background of certain scenes, particularly those set at locations where newspapers are likely to be visible, the shopper appears folded to an interior page rather than the front, and the page visible is not news coverage but opinion. Background op-ed columns. Background editorial cartoons. Background letters to the editor from Springfield residents who apparently have strong feelings about local governance, the power plant, the school curriculum, the behavior of their neighbors. These background opinion sections are written. Someone wrote them. They are not lorem ipsum text, not repeated placeholder strings. They are actual sentences, actual arguments, actual editorial positions set in a font small enough to be nearly illegible at broadcast resolution and placed in a background position that gives them essentially no opportunity to be read, except by someone with a pause button and a reason to look. Those someone with a pause button readings reveal a Springfield with opinions, a town full of people who have things to say about how their community is run and who are saying them in the opinion section of a newspaper that, like the newspaper itself, most people in the foreground are not reading. Springfield citizens have been writing letters to the editor for 36 years. Their views on the power plant, on Burns, on the school, on the government, on all of the things that the show's main characters are either ignoring or perpetuating. Those views are there. In the background, in the small text of the editorial section, in the newspaper on the table that Homer is using as a coaster. The people of Springfield are not all as passive as the show's main stories suggest. Some of them are writing letters. Some of them are trying to say something. The evidence is in the background newspaper, waiting for someone to read it. There are specific headline writers on The Shopper whose sensibility is detectable across different episodes. Not because they are named, but because certain headlines carry a consistent voice, a particular way of describing events that suggests the same person wrote them. A dry, slightly mournful sensibility. A tendency to describe human disasters in the register of minor inconvenience. A gift for the headline that is technically accurate and ethically devastating simultaneously. This writer, whoever they are, has been covering Springfield's worst decisions with the patient precision of someone who expected the decisions and is not surprised by the outcomes, but who maintains the professional obligation to document them anyway. Their headlines appear in the background of scenes that have nothing to do with the events they describe. They are read by no one in the episode and barely anyone watching at home. They are, in their small and background way, the most honest journalism in Springfield. The truest account of what the town is doing to itself, printed in a newspaper that sits face up on kitchen tables during scenes about something completely different, completely available to anyone who chose to look. The Springfield Shopper is a documentary record of everything the show's stories cannot bring themselves to address directly, and it has been published in the background of Springfield for 36 years, waiting for a reader. Section 6. Signs, Billboards, and Storefronts of Springfield. If you wanted to understand a town without talking to anyone in it, you could learn an enormous amount just from its signs. Signs are a town's public language. They announce what the town values, what it sells, what it warns against, what it celebrates. They are the visible surface of a community's economy and its civic priorities and its sense of humor. And Springfield has signs everywhere. Signs on storefronts and signs on billboards and signs on civic buildings and signs on vehicles and signs on the walls of the school and signs in the windows of the houses and signs hanging from the ceiling of every commercial space in the town. Most viewers of The Simpsons have processed these signs as background texture, visual noise that fills the frame and makes Springfield look like an actual commercial environment. The joke signs, the ones with obvious puns in the business names, those get noticed and shared and celebrated. Everyone knows the quick E-Mart sign. Everyone knows the occasional storefront with a gag name. These are designed to be noticed. They are foreground jokes dressed as background details. But most of Springfield's signs are not dressed as foreground jokes. They are just signs, announcing things, selling things, warning against things. And if you catalog them, if you treat them not as background texture but as information, they tell a story about Springfield's economy and its priorities and the life of the town that the show's actual storylines never quite assemble. The storefronts of Springfield's commercial district change across the run of the show, and the direction of that change is consistent. Businesses that exist in the early seasons are replaced by other businesses in later seasons. The specific businesses that disappear and the specific businesses that replace them follow a pattern. Small, independently owned specialty businesses close. They are replaced by chain stores or by vacant properties. A local bookstore disappears and is replaced, in a later season's establishing shot, by a discount everything store. A local restaurant that appeared in background shots of Springfield's main commercial strip for several seasons is gone one day, and the space has new signage for something generic and corporate. A hardware store that was family-owned based on its sign's visual language becomes, in later seasons, a location that the sign identifies as a subsidiary of a larger company. Springfield's economy, visible in the background of street scenes across the show's run, undergoes the same transformation that happened to the economies of thousands of actual American small towns between the 1980s and the 2010s. Local businesses are replaced by chains. Independent ownership yields to corporate standardization. The particular is absorbed by the generic. This has been happening in Springfield's background for 36 years. The signs have been changing. Nobody in the foreground has mentioned it. The economic transformation of the town that employed Homer and fed the Simpson family has been documented entirely in the background signage of street scenes. visible to anyone who was comparing the storefronts of Season 4 to the storefronts of Season 24. The billboard situation is its own category of analysis. Springfield has billboards, lots of them. They advertise local businesses and civic events and political candidates and occasional products that should probably not be advertised. And Springfield's billboards change with some regularity, reflecting the current advertising priorities of whatever entity has purchased the space. But there are certain billboard locations in Springfield that appear consistently in establishing shots and traffic scenes, and these locations serve as a kind of public bulletin board for the town's current preoccupations. What is being advertised on Springfield's most prominent billboards in any given season tells you something about what Springfield's institutions are trying to sell the population in that period. In earlier seasons, the prominent billboards tend toward local consumer goods and civic messaging. The local businesses, the local events, the ordinary commercial life of an American town at a specific moment. In later seasons, the billboards shift. The advertising becomes more corporate, more generic, more disconnected from anything specific to Springfield as a place. The local business advertising is replaced by national brands. The civic messaging gives way to commercial messaging. The billboards of Springfield have been gradually colonized by the same corporate standardization that has been happening in the storefronts. And this colonization is visible in the background of street scenes across the show's run as a slow, consistent replacement of the local with the national, of the specific with the generic. There is one specific billboard that appears in the background of Springfield establishing shots with enough consistency to constitute a running visual motif, and it advertises a product that does not exist in the real world, but that is specific enough in its description to function as a portrait of whatever Springfield is being sold in that particular period. The billboard changes content across seasons, but it occupies the same location, holds the same prominent position in the Springfield skyline, and its changing content is a kind of visual diary of what commercial interests have been pushing to the population of the town across the show's entire run. Nobody in the show has ever referenced this billboard. It is too consistent to be accidental. Someone placed it there and kept it there and changed what it said across seasons because the changing content was the point. The warning signs of Springfield are equally revealing. American public spaces are full of warning signs, caution signs and prohibition signs and regulatory notices and safety advisories. These signs form a kind of legal infrastructure of the spaces they occupy, a record of what the authorities have decided the public needs to be protected from, or warned about, or prevented from doing. Springfield's warning signs are remarkable in their content. The warnings posted around the nuclear power plant, visible in background establishing shots of the facility, are specific enough in their language to be genuinely alarming if you read them carefully. They do not say the generic things that safety signage says. They say specific things about specific types of radiation exposure and specific types of biological effects that specific radiation sources produce. They say things that a sign at a facility would only say if the facility had specific experience with the specific problem the sign warns against. The power plant's warning signs have been documenting its hazards in the background of exterior shots since the show began. They are legible at higher resolution. They contain information about the facility's specific dangers that the show's dialogue has never quite stated directly. The signs are more honest than the characters. The signs cannot soften their message with a joke or deflect with charm. They say what they say, and they have been saying it, in the background of establishing shots, for 36 years. Then there are Springfield's civic signs, the ones that announce town boundaries, town mottos, town ordinances. These signs change across the show's run in ways that reflect the changing priorities of Springfield's municipal government, and the changes are not always in a positive direction. Springfield's town motto changes. The original motto, which was posted on the town limits sign in early seasons, expressed a civic aspiration that was modest but genuine. By later seasons, the town limits sign carries a different motto. The aspiration has been revised. The language has changed in a direction that, if you track the progression, suggests a community in the process of lowering its expectations about what kind of town it is and what it can hope to be. The civic signs of Springfield record a gradual loss of civic ambition. The town that was trying to be something in 1989 is, by its later seasons, A town that has adjusted its public self-description to match what it has become rather than what it once hoped to be. And this adjustment is documented in the background of establishing shots, in the changing text on signs that most viewers saw without reading across 36 years of the show. The storefront signs also reward close reading for another reason. They contain hidden information about the people who own the businesses. A sign's design choices, its typography, its language, its visual style, communicates something about the kind of person who made the decisions behind it. The storefront signs of Springfield contain, in their visual design, portraits of the people who run the businesses, expressed entirely through signage. The businesses that Homer and his family frequent most often have signs that tell you something about the people behind them, without the show ever spelling it out. Moe's Tavern's sign has the visual language of a place that is not trying to attract new customers because it does not believe new customers exist. The Quickie Mart sign has the visual language of a business that is performing cheerfulness without quite feeling it. The Springfield nuclear power plant's public-facing signage has the visual language of a corporate communications department that is paid to reassure and has a great deal to reassure about. These are all compressed portraits, character studies in signage, delivered in the background of scenes where the actual character studies are happening in dialogue and action. These secondary portraits in sign form add depth and specificity to the world in a way that functions completely silently and completely below the threshold of the show's stated focus. Springfield signs have been telling the truth about the town since the beginning. They have been doing it in the background, in small text, on boards and windows and walls and billboards, in a language that everyone in Springfield reads every day, and nobody in the foreground ever seems to register. The signs are the most public communication in the whole town. They are also the least attended to, which is, when you think about it, a perfect description of Springfield's relationship with information. It is there. It has always been there. It just requires you to stop and read it. Section 7. The visual gags hidden in plain sight. There is a tradition in animation, older than The Simpsons and more widespread than most viewers know, of hiding things in frames. Single frames, brief visual jokes, images that pass too quickly at broadcast speed to be consciously registered, but that the subconscious catches and that create a low-level sensation of having missed something without knowing what. The Simpsons has done this since its earliest seasons. But The Simpsons, being The Simpsons, did not restrict this practice to single frames or pure comedy. The show extended the tradition of hidden visual gags into something larger and stranger, a system of visual callbacks, references, and planted details that reward the viewer who is cross-referencing what they are currently watching against what they have previously watched. The most famous category of this is the character who appears in the background of a scene that predicts their later major appearance. A character who will become important in a subsequent episode exists in the background of an earlier scene, in a position and context that, read in retrospect, was foreshadowing their importance. They are not hidden in a single frame. They are standing in the background of a crowd scene, or sitting in the background of a restaurant, or walking past in the background of a street scene, doing nothing narratively significant, but present in a way that rewards the viewer who returns to the episode after seeing what the character eventually becomes. These plants are deliberate. The writing staff plans them. A character who will be introduced in a future episode is placed in the background of an earlier one, as a kind of scavenger hunt item for the audience's future viewing. The show rewards rewatching in the most fundamental way possible, by putting things in the background of earlier episodes that only become meaningful later. But this practice extends beyond character plants into something more atmospheric. There are visual motifs in The Simpsons, recurring images and objects and color choices and compositional patterns that appear in the background of scenes across the show's run in ways that build associations over time. A specific object that appears in the background of scenes that share a thematic content. A color palette that recurs in the background of scenes dealing with a specific emotional register. A compositional choice, the way the background is framed relative to the foreground action, that becomes associated over time with a specific type of moment. These are the visual grammar of the show. The language that the camera speaks in the background while the characters speak in the foreground. And, like any language, it becomes more legible with time and familiarity. A viewer who has watched hundreds of episodes begins to feel the background meaning of certain visual choices without being able to articulate why. The background of a scene creates a mood that the dialogue may not be saying directly. The visual grammar of the background is the show's emotional subtext made visible. The background expressions of characters who are not the scene's focus are a particularly rich field for this kind of reading. When the camera is on Homer, and Homer is the scene's focus, and Homer is saying something funny or embarrassing or earnest, the background characters are reacting. Their reactions are part of the visual information of the frame even though they are not the focus. And those reactions, across the show's run, are not always the reactions you would expect. The background character who reacts to Homer with an expression of genuine recognition, the expression of someone who knows exactly what is happening and has seen it before and has long since decided how they feel about it, appears often enough to constitute a visual motif. This character is not laughing at Homer. They are not judging him. They are observing him with the patient, somewhat tired recognition of someone who has been in a town where Homer exists for long enough that his behavior has become fully legible. This expression, this particular background expression of patient recognition, is one of the show's most honest visual moments. Because Homer, from the outside, from the perspective of someone who has known him for years and understands the shape of his catastrophes, is not funny. He is just a man who does the same kinds of things over and over, and the people around him have accommodated this. The background expression of patient recognition is the visual record of that accommodation. The show puts it in the background because it is too sad for the foreground. There is also the visual gag of the perpetual foreground clutter. In many of the interior scenes of the Simpson home, the foreground and middle ground of the frame contain objects, dishes on the counter, toys on the floor, newspapers half-folded on furniture, remote controls that have drifted from their original positions, clothes draped over chairs, the ordinary visual chaos of a house that is actively lived in. This clutter changes, not dramatically, not in a way that is plotted or tracked or referenced in any storyline. But if you examine the household objects visible in the backgrounds and foregrounds of Simpson house scenes across the show's run, the inventory of objects changes in ways that are consistent with a family that is accumulating things, losing things, having things break and get replaced or not replaced. The Simpson house's object inventory is a record of time passing that the show's characters cannot carry because they do not age. It is the evidence of domestic life accumulating in the background of a family that is frozen in time. The toys change because children's toys change over the decades, and the animators update the background objects to reflect the current era. The books on the shelves change. The technology visible in the background changes. The domestic landscape updates itself to remain contemporary, even as the family within it stays the same age forever. The background objects of the Simpson house are the floating timeline made visible. The family is fixed. The world around them keeps updating. The stuff in the house records the years passing in the only way the show's premise allows. The visual gags and the art on the walls are their own category. The Simpson house has artwork, prints, and paintings, and the occasional photograph that exists in the background of living room and dining room scenes. These pieces of art are almost never commented on in the show's dialogue. They are part of the domestic visual environment, texture rather than content. But some of them are wrong. Some of the artwork visible in the background of Simpson home scenes is not the kind of artwork a middle-class family in Springfield would own. It is too specific, too unusual, too laden with art world references that are too knowing for the context. A background painting in the Simpson living room that, if you pause and examine it, is a parody of a specific famous painting. A parody that requires familiarity with the original to appreciate. A print in a background position that is a direct visual reference to something outside the world of The Simpsons entirely, placed there for the viewer who would recognize it and completely invisible to the viewer who would not. The writers put things on The Simpsons' walls that The Simpsons would not put on their walls. They address the viewer directly through the family's background art. The Simpson home's visual environment occasionally speaks a language that Homer and Marge do not know and that only the audience or a portion of it can read. This is the visual equivalent of the background newspaper. The art on the walls contains messages for the viewer that are not accessible to the characters standing in front of them. The show creates a private channel of communication through the background visual environment, a channel that operates simultaneously with the episode's main narrative. A parallel story told in background art that the family cannot see. There are also the visual gags that are specifically constructed for the pause button. These are the details that are placed in the frame with the knowledge that some viewers will stop the image and examine it. A piece of text that is too small to read at broadcast speed, but that contains actual readable content if you freeze the frame and zoom. A background object that is partially obscured in the moving image but fully visible when the motion stops. A facial expression in the background that flashes across the frame too quickly to consciously register, but that is fully drawn and fully intentional and fully legible when you catch it. The pause button gags or GIFs. They are the production team's acknowledgement that some viewers are paying more attention than the broadcast format requires, and their way of rewarding that attention. But they are also, cumulatively, a statement about the nature of attention and reward. The show gives you everything you need to enjoy it at broadcast speed. And then it gives you more for the viewer who chooses to look more carefully. The extra layer is never the most important layer. The foreground always carries the essential story. But the pause button layer, the hidden in plain sight layer, the background visual grammar layer, this layer exists in the show as a proof of something. A proof that the people who made it were paying more attention to every frame than the broadcast format required. A proof that care was applied to parts of the image that most viewers would never examine. Care that would go unnoticed. Care that was applied anyway. That is one of the things the background visual gags prove about The Simpsons. Not that the show is clever, which it obviously is, but that the people who made it brought craft to every corner of every frame, even when that craft would never be acknowledged and never be recognized by the vast majority of the show's enormous audience. They painted the details in the background not because they needed to, because they wanted to, because Springfield deserved them. Section 8. The Music and Sound Design Secrets. Alf Clausen scored The Simpsons for 27 years. 27 years. More than 700 episodes. More musical material than most composers produce across entire careers. And Clausen was not simply providing background music for a cartoon. He was doing something considerably more sophisticated, something that most viewers have been hearing their entire lives without quite understanding what they were hearing. He was writing character themes, not simply one theme per character, though the show has those too, but a system of musical associations so consistent and so carefully maintained across the show's run that the score, listened to carefully, tells you things about the characters that the dialogue does not say, things about their emotional states, things about their relationship to each other, things about the way the show understands them beneath the surface of the jokes. Homer Simpson has a musical theme, the one you know, the one that plays during his establishing moments, his arriving home music, but he also has a secondary musical phrase that appears in the score at specific moments. Moments when Homer is unobserved and unperformed. Moments when he is alone with something true about himself. This phrase is quieter and smaller than his main theme. It appears under scenes where Homer's behavior drops the defenses that his usual presentation requires. And it is sad. It is a distinctly sad musical phrase for a character the show generally presents as a source of comedy. Clausen played this phrase in the background of Homer's quieter moments across 2.5 decades, and most viewers never distinguished it from the general musical texture of the episode. But it is there. It has always been there. The score was saying something about Homer that the dialogue was not saying, in the musical language of a theme that only activates when Homer is being himself instead of performing himself. Marge has a musical association too, and it is revealing in a different way. Marge's musical motif, when you isolate it and listen to it carefully, is built around a specific interval that in classical music theory is associated with longing. It is not a desperate longing. It is not the musical language of tragedy or crisis. It is the smaller, more domestic longing of someone who has accommodated themselves to a life that is not quite what they imagined, and who has found a way to love it anyway, but in whom the gap between the imagined and the actual is still audible to the careful listener. Clausen played this interval under Marge's quieter moments across hundreds of episodes. The longing is in the music beneath her practicality. It plays under her competence and her patience and her love for Homer as a counterpoint, as the score's acknowledgement of what Marge contains, that the episode's story does not always have space to address. The music for Burns is architecturally grand, in the way that one would expect for a character of his wealth and power. But the specific harmonic choices in Burns's musical scoring contain something that the grandeur covers up, a fundamental instability in the harmonic structure that suggests something decaying at the foundations of the edifice. The surface of Burns's music is imposing. The structure beneath it is not quite solid. The score knew something about Burns that the show only confirmed gradually. The sound design of Springfield, separate from the music, deserves its own analysis. Springfield has a sound, not a single sound, but a consistent sonic environment that appears under exterior Springfield scenes throughout the show's run and that, if you listen to it carefully, contains layers. The foreground of Springfield's sound is the ordinary sounds of an American town. Traffic, voices, the ambient activity of public space. But under those sounds, in the mix, there is something else. A low-frequency presence. A distant, almost subsonic hum that is present in enough Springfield exterior scenes to constitute a design choice rather than a coincidence of production. The sound is consistent with the sound that large machinery makes at a distance. Consistent with what you would hear if you lived in a town where a large industrial facility was operating continuously. The sound of Springfield, underneath the traffic and the voices, is the sound of the power plant. It is in the audio mix of the show's exterior scenes. It has been since the beginning. Most viewers have never separated it from the ambient sound texture, but it is there, a constant low-level presence in Springfield's sonic environment, the facility that runs everything, making its presence felt in the audio background of every outdoor scene. Springfield sounds like a town with a nuclear power plant, because it is. And the sound design has been telling you this for 36 years, underneath everything else. The music that plays during transitions between scenes is another area where Clausen's scoring contains more information than most viewers process. Transition music in television is typically functional, a brief musical gesture that bridges one scene to the next and maintains the episode's tempo. In The Simpsons, transition music is sometimes functional and sometimes something more. There are transitions in the show's history where the brief musical passage between scenes contains, compressed into perhaps 10 or 15 seconds, an emotional statement about the relationship between the scene that just ended and the scene that is about to begin. A statement that the dialogue of neither scene makes directly. The music reads the space between the scenes, the unspoken connection, the thematic or emotional bridge that links two apparently separate story moments. These brief transitions are among the most purely expressive musical writing in the show. They last almost nothing. They are sandwiched between scenes. They are the least likely portion of any episode to receive conscious attention from a viewer, and they occasionally contain, in a few bars of music, the emotional truth of what the episode is about. The Simpsons has a complicated relationship with licensed music, the real songs from outside the show that appear in various episodes. Some of these are used for obvious comic effect, chosen for the immediate joke they make in context. But some of them are chosen for a different reason, their lyrics. The songs that appear in background contexts, playing on a radio or coming from a television in the background of a scene, are occasionally songs whose lyrics, if you are listening to the words, directly comment on what is happening in the episode's foreground. This is not always subtle. The show sometimes puts a song on the radio and expects you to catch that the lyrics are relevant. But sometimes it is very subtle indeed. A song playing at a low level in the background of a scene, mixed under the dialogue whose lyrics are about exactly the thing the scene is about, but from a perspective or in a register that the scene itself does not access. The song is saying what the scene cannot say directly, in the background, under the conversation, at a level where you might catch it or might not. This is, in musical terms, the same practice as the background newspaper headline and the background sign. The show creates multiple simultaneous channels of communication, some in the foreground and some in the background, and places information in the background channels for the viewer who is listening to more than one thing at once. The musical choices for the show's most emotionally significant moments are worth particular attention. When The Simpsons reaches for genuine feeling, when it steps out of comedy into something more vulnerable and more honest, the music is doing a great deal of the lifting. The episodes that are remembered as emotionally powerful, the ones that viewers return to because they contain something true about family, or loss, or love, or the passage of time, these episodes are scored with particular care. The music in these episodes does not just accompany the emotion, it generates it. It arrives slightly before the scene's emotional peak and prepares the viewer for what is coming. It carries the feeling past the scene's end, into the transition, into the beginning of the next scene, extending the emotional moment beyond its visual context. Clausen understood something about The Simpsons that many of the show's critics missed, that the show's comedy was always in service of its emotional truth, and that the music's job was to maintain awareness of that truth even when the foreground was being very funny about something else. The score kept the emotional subtext alive. It played under the jokes as a reminder of what the jokes were covering. It played under the catastrophes as a reminder of what was at stake. And it played under the quiet domestic scenes, under Homer eating cereal and Marge washing dishes and Bart watching television and Lisa playing saxophone, as a reminder of why those ordinary moments were worth watching. The music understood that the ordinary moments of the Simpson family were the show's whole argument, that the case The Simpsons was making was not about nuclear power or urban decay or political corruption, though it was about those things too. The case it was making was about a family eating cereal in the morning, and the music played that case straight, without irony, with the full sincerity of a composer who understood what he was scoring. For 27 years, Alf Clausen played it honestly in the background of a comedy show, and most people heard it as background music. Every episode of The Simpsons begins the same way. The clouds part. The camera descends into Springfield. The music swells, and we arrive at Springfield Elementary just in time to see Bart Simpson at the chalkboard, writing a sentence over and over again, a sentence that is different every episode, a sentence that arrives and departs in approximately 4 seconds. Most viewers read it quickly or do not read it at all. It is the opening. It is part of the ritual. It is Bart being punished, which is a perfectly normal state of affairs, and the specific sentence he is writing is secondary to the visual of him writing it, the hunched posture, the bored expression, the chalk squeaking against the board. But those sentences are where the writers hid some of their most unguarded, most genuinely strange, most revealing work. And when you read them carefully, not the famous ones that have been cataloged and quoted in books about the show, but the quieter ones, the odder ones, the ones that seem to be about something other than what they are pretending to be about, you find a different kind of writing room at work. A writing room that used the opening credits as a message board. The famous ones are easy. I will not sell land in Florida. I will not expose the ignorance of the faculty. I will not conduct my own fire drills. These are jokes about Bart being a particular kind of troublemaker, and they are funny, and they are exactly what they appear to be. They are the chalkboard gags in the way that a surface reading would describe chalkboard gags. But then there are the others, the ones that do not quite resolve into a joke on first reading. The cafeteria deep fryer is not a toy suggests that an incident occurred that the episode is not going to tell you about. I will not yell she's dead during roll call raises questions the show has absolutely no intention of answering. These are not jokes with a setup and a punchline. They are fragments of stories. They are the aftermath of events that happened before the episode started and that the episode will never explain. They are evidence of a Springfield that exists between episodes. A Springfield that keeps generating incidents and consequences and chalkboard-worthy infractions, even when the cameras are not rolling. And then there are the ones that are not about Bart at all. Not really. These are the ones that feel, when you sit with them long enough, like they might have been written by someone who was working through something. I will not make flatulent noises in class. That is Bart. That is entirely Bart. But what about guilt is not just for Catholics? That one sits differently. It is too short to be a full joke. It is too specific to be completely throwaway. It reads like something someone on the writing staff needed to write down somewhere, and the chalkboard was where it ended up. I am not authorized to fire substitute teachers. This one is funny in a very specific way that requires you to think about what it means for an elementary school student to be concerned about the limits of their own authority. It suggests that Bart had a plan. It suggests the plan failed at the authorization stage rather than the execution stage. It suggests that someone on the writing staff was thinking about institutional power structures while writing a 4-second opening gag for a cartoon. The chalkboard gags also have a relationship with the news cycle that most viewers miss entirely, because the gags pass too quickly to be contextualized. Over the show's long run, the writing staff used the chalkboard to respond to current events, to things happening in the entertainment industry, to things happening inside the production of the show itself. Some of these references were obvious enough that contemporary viewers caught them. Others were inside enough that they were almost entirely for the production team's own amusement. There is a category of chalkboard gag that appears to be a direct message from the writers to the network. "I will not waste chalk" has appeared in various forms over the years, which is a fairly elegant way of commenting on the concept of the chalkboard gag itself, the idea that this ritual, repeated hundreds of times, might have started to feel like it was consuming resources that could have gone elsewhere. It is the show commenting on its own format from inside its own format, which is a very particular kind of self-awareness. And then there are the chalkboard gags that seem to be about specific interpersonal dynamics within the writer's room that the public would have had no way of decoding. These are the ones that are slightly too specific, too pointed, to be purely fictional. "I will not call my teacher hotcakes" makes sense as a Bart joke. But "I will not create art or music unless it moves merchandise" does not sound like Bart. It sounds like someone who is frustrated about something real. It sounds like a comment on the economics of creativity that was slipped into the opening credits of a television show because that was the only place left to put it. The chalkboard gags that lasted only one season are worth particular attention. Some of them were retired because the joke had been thoroughly made. Others were retired for less obvious reasons. They were too specific, too raw, too much like the writing room talking to itself in a way that risked becoming legible to the outside. There is also the question of what happens to the chalkboard between the writing of the sentence and the end of Bart's punishment. The camera always catches him in the middle of the task, never at the end. The board is always full of the sentence repeating in chalk 50 times, 100 times, and Bart is always somewhere in the middle of the repetition. What the show never shows us is whether he finishes, whether he gets to the end of whatever number Mrs. Krabappel assigned, whether he puts down the chalk and leaves, or whether he is still there when the building empties at the end of the school day, still writing, the sentence accumulating on the board around him. The show refuses to resolve this. It picks him up mid-punishment and deposits him into the episode, and the chalkboard stays in its particular moment of infinite incompletion. This is not an accident. The writers understood that the chalkboard gag works precisely because it is unresolved. If we saw Bart finish, it would be a completed punishment with a clear endpoint. By always catching him in the middle, the show transforms the punishment into something more like a state of being. Bart does not get punished at the chalkboard. Bart exists at the chalkboard. It is where he is, perpetually, in the eternal opening credits moment that precedes every story the show has ever told about him. And there is something very right about that, because Bart is always in some stage of a consequence. He is always somewhere in the middle of paying for something he did, and the end of that payment is always deferred, always just out of frame, always a few more repetitions away. The chalkboard in this reading is not a punishment device, it is a portrait. The variation in Bart's handwriting across the seasons also tells a story that nobody read as a story. In the early seasons, the writing on the chalkboard is slightly larger, slightly more childlike. The letters have the specific unevenness of a hand that is still learning to hold a tool properly. As the seasons progress, the handwriting tightens. It becomes more consistent, more resigned. The letters stop varying in size. The lines become more regular. The writing of a child in the early seasons becomes, gradually and almost imperceptibly, the writing of someone who has been doing this for a very long time and is no longer surprised by it. This is never mentioned. The show does not comment on the evolution of Bart's chalkboard handwriting, but it is there. Frame by frame, season by season, you can watch a child become practiced at his own punishment, which is either very funny or very sad, depending on how much attention you have been paying. The chalkboard also occasionally contains errors. Not Bart's errors in the fiction of the show, but actual production errors, sentences where a word has been slightly misspelled, where the line breaks are awkward, where the repetitions are not quite consistent. These are the moments where the artifice of the gag becomes briefly visible. The sentences are not written by Bart. They are drawn by animators, lettered frame by frame, and occasionally the lettering slips. A letter goes slightly wrong. A word gets compressed. The illusion wavers. Most viewers never notice. The gag is moving too quickly and the focus is never on precision. But if you pause on the chalkboard at exactly the right frame, you can sometimes catch these small imperfections. And there is something strangely touching about them. The animators were drawing this opening sequence for the 10,000th time, and the chalk slipped slightly, and the error made it into the final cut, and nobody caught it in post. And it aired, and it is still there in the archive. A tiny human mistake embedded in the opening of an episode that millions of people have watched. The chalkboard gags also have an internal timeline that the show itself does not maintain. Taken in sequence, across all 700 and some episodes, the gags suggest a version of Bart's school career that does not match the Frozen and Amber continuity of the show. If you read them chronologically, Bart accumulates a history of infractions that would have resulted in expulsion many times over. The school system of Springfield, as implied by the sum total of every chalkboard sentence Bart has ever written, is extraordinarily tolerant, or extraordinarily overwhelmed. The chalkboard does not change Bart's relationship with the school, and the school does not change its relationship with Bart. They are locked in a permanent arrangement where the punishment is always the chalkboard, and the infraction is always something new, and the outcome is always the same non-outcome. This is, when you think about it for long enough, the most honest thing the show has ever said about institutional discipline. The punishment is theatrical. The behavior continues. The chalkboard fills and is presumably erased and fills again. Nothing changes. The institution performs correction. The child performs contrition. And tomorrow there will be a new sentence, a new infraction, a new moment of chalk against board, and Springfield Elementary will continue to function exactly as it always has, which is to say, not very well, but steadily enough. What the chalkboard gags collectively add up to, across 36 years of episodes, is a document. A very strange, very funny, sometimes surprisingly melancholy document about a child who keeps getting caught doing things that are not quite allowed, written by a room full of adults who remember very clearly what it felt like to be caught. The couch gag is the part of the opening credits where the Simpsons family runs into their living room and something unusual happens on the couch. Sometimes they find strangers there. Sometimes the couch transforms. Sometimes they discover they are part of a larger reality that their living room cannot contain. Sometimes the couch simply is not there, and the family must deal with this in whatever way the animators have decided. The gag changes every episode, or almost every episode. There are repeats, particularly in the early seasons, when the show was still finding its footing and the couch gag was a fairly simple affair. But over time, as the show settled in and the animation team grew more ambitious, and the cultural footprint of The Simpsons grew large enough to attract guest artists from outside the traditional animation world, the couch gag became something else entirely. It became the most experimental space in the most successful franchise in television animation history. And within that experimental space, if you look at the full sequence of couch gags across the show's entire run, something emerges. Not a clean narrative, not a story with a beginning and middle and end, but a drift, a gradual movement from one kind of thing toward another kind of thing. A timeline that is not about the Simpsons family at all, but about the people who make the show and how their understanding of what the show is has shifted over 36 years. The early couch gags are simple. The family runs in and something mildly surprising happens. There are already too many people on the couch. The family arrives and they are wearing each other's bodies. The couch is replaced by a cactus. These are gags in the most precise sense of the word: short, fast, punchy, over before they fully register. They are the opening credits equivalent of a rim shot. They set up the expectation that something normal is about to happen, deliver something slightly abnormal, and move on. Then a shift begins to happen, very gradually, somewhere around the middle seasons. The couch gags start to take longer. They start to have setups and developments that require more than a second to execute. The family runs in, yes, but what happens next is not immediately legible. It takes a moment to understand what the joke is, and that moment of not quite understanding is part of the experience. The gag is not simply delivered, it unfolds. And as the gags grow longer, they also grow stranger. More specifically, strange. A couch gag will suddenly be a meticulous parody of a specific film that requires some cultural knowledge to decode. Another will be a nearly wordless short film that tells a complete story about the birth and death of the universe and the small irrelevance of any individual couch in the sweep of cosmic time. Another will be drawn in a style that looks like a different country's animation tradition, not American, not the Simpsons house style, something with different proportions and different line weights, and a different sense of what a human being looks like when they are moving. These later couch gags are not gags anymore. They are meditations. They are small films. They are the show pausing its own opening to do something that has nothing to do with the episode that follows, something that the writers and animators made because they wanted to make it, and the opening credits were the place where they had the most freedom. The couch gags made by guest artists tell a particular story about the show's cultural position. When Banksy directed a couch gag, it was a comment on the global economics of animation production that was simultaneously very funny and deeply uncomfortable. When Bill Plimpton made one, it was formally unlike anything else in the show's history, the family's bodies behaving according to rules that the show's usual animation does not apply. When the show produced a Game of Thrones parody couch gag, it was a reminder that The Simpsons exists in the same cultural landscape as everything else, and is capable of commenting on that landscape from within its own opening sequence. But the guest artist couch gags are only part of the story. The in-house couch gags have their own internal evolution that is subtler and in some ways more revealing. Look at the couch gags that are explicitly about the show's own history. There is a category of gag where the family arrives on the couch only to discover something about the nature of the show itself. They are cartoon characters, they are merchandise, they are being watched by an audience. They exist inside a snow globe. They are made of pixels. They have been running since 1989, and the couch has been there the whole time. These gags are the show looking in the mirror. They are the production team acknowledging, from inside the fiction of Springfield, that there is an outside, and that the outside has been watching for a very long time, and that the people making the show are as aware of this as the people watching it. The density of these self-referential gags increases as the show ages. This is not a coincidence. A show in its third season does not have enough history to turn back and look at itself. A show in its 30th season has enough history to fill multiple couch gags with nothing but references to its own archive. The show becomes, over time, capable of having a conversation with its own past that its past was not old enough to have. And then there are the couch gags that feel genuinely sad, not in a way that the show would acknowledge or that the episode following them would continue. Just briefly, in the space of a few seconds, there is a couch gag that asks what it would mean if any of this were real, if Springfield were real, if Homer's joy at making it to the couch were real, if the family were real people rather than animated lines. These gags flicker past too quickly to be properly mourned. The episode begins. The sadness, if it was ever there, disappears. There is a couch gag where Homer sits on the couch alone and does not move. The rest of the family does not arrive. He just sits. This gag lasts longer than it needs to and is less funny than most couch gags and exists for some reason that the show does not explain. Homer sitting alone on the couch in silence for a few seconds longer than expected is not the setup for a joke. It is just Homer on the couch. And then the episode begins. That couch gag aired in the middle of a season that was otherwise unremarkable. The episode that followed it was perfectly standard. Nobody who worked on the show has ever explained what it meant or whether it meant anything at all. It might have been a production timing issue. It might have been a moment of genuine strange melancholy that slipped into the opening credits. It might have been both of these things at once, which is the most Simpsons answer of all. The timeline of the couch gags, when you watch them in sequence, shows a show that started as one thing and became many things simultaneously. The early gags are confident in a specific way. They know what a couch gag is for, and they do that thing well. The middle gags are ambitious, reaching outward, trying new forms, becoming something other than gags. The late gags are sometimes spectacular, and sometimes quiet, and sometimes self-referential, and sometimes formally adventurous. But they are no longer trying to prove anything. They do not need to. The show is 36 years old. The couch has been in the living room for all of those years. Whatever the gag is going to do, it does it, and then the opening credits continue, and the episode begins, and Springfield goes on. Springfield is a town that does not follow the rules of geography, and the show has never been ashamed of this. The geography of Springfield is internally inconsistent in ways that are so consistent they become their own system. The power plant is sometimes within walking distance of the Simpsons house, and sometimes seems to require a long drive. The school is sometimes just down the street, and sometimes it takes a school bus to get there. The center of town, with its shops and restaurants and Moe's Tavern, seems to occupy a different spatial relationship with Evergreen Terrace depending on which episode you are watching and what the story requires. This is, on one level, a practical necessity. Television animation does not have the budget to be geographically precise. And a show that has been running for 36 years cannot maintain perfect spatial consistency across hundreds of writers and production cycles. The geography shifts because it needs to. The story goes where the story needs to go. But there is another level on which Springfield's impossible geography is deliberate. The show has leaned into it. It has made jokes about it. It has had characters reference the impossibility of the town's layout in ways that acknowledge the joke while never resolving it. Springfield is not a real town. It is a cartoon town. And cartoon towns do not follow the rules of cartography. They follow the rules of narrative. They are always exactly as large as the story needs them to be, and always arranged in exactly the configuration that makes the scene work. What this means, for the background architecture of Springfield, is that the buildings have to do more work than the geography. Because the geography cannot be trusted, the buildings are where the town's identity gets anchored. The same storefront appears in multiple neighborhoods of Springfield simultaneously. The same water tower marks the skyline regardless of which direction you are approaching from. The same diner exists on multiple streets. These repetitions are partly a production economy. Once you have drawn a good storefront, you reuse it, but they are also the visual equivalent of a small town feeling. In a real small town, the same few landmarks appear no matter where you turn. Springfield replicates this feeling through repetition, even if the repetition is not geographically coherent. The buildings of Springfield are also aging at a rate that the show does not fully acknowledge, but the background quietly documents. The power plant, which is always depicted as a slightly decrepit facility that should probably be inspected more thoroughly than it is, has accumulated visual damage over the seasons. Cracks appear in the concrete of its cooling towers in later episodes that were not there in earlier ones. The fence around the perimeter has a section that is perpetually bowed outward, as though something pushed against it from the inside and the maintenance budget for fixing it has never materialized. The building does not get worse in any way that the story acknowledges. Homer's job does not change. The safety violations do not mount in any canonical way. But the building, in the background, shows the slow accumulation of deferred maintenance that any building of that age and that level of care would show. The town hall is a building that the show has used for decades as the setting for Springfield's civic life, the town meetings, the referendums, the occasions when the community gathers to make collective decisions that it will immediately reverse or ignore. And the town hall's background details are a quiet record of civic dysfunction that the foreground never addresses. The bulletin board outside the building is always crowded with notices, and the notices are always slightly out of date. The events listed have already happened. The meeting times posted are for meetings that concluded weeks or months ago. The town hall has never gotten around to removing them, and they have accumulated into a palimpsest of Springfield's civic life layer upon layer of past events, each one slightly obscuring the one before it. The elementary school's architecture is worth dwelling on because it is both deeply familiar and quietly wrong in ways that take time to identify. The building is recognizable as a school, the institutional windows, the flat roof, the parking lot designed for buses, but the proportions are slightly off in a way that the show maintains consistently. The windows are a little too narrow. The doors are a little too tall. The hallways, in interior scenes, seem longer than a building of the school's apparent size should contain. This is partly an animation convention and partly a deliberate choice to make the building feel simultaneously familiar and slightly strange, which is exactly how many people remember their elementary schools. They were ordinary buildings made slightly surreal by the intensity of the experiences that happened inside them. The church is one of the most architecturally stable buildings in Springfield. It looks approximately the same in the first season as it does in the most recent episodes. The windows have the same slightly formal quality. The sign outside has the same format, a biblical or inspirational phrase, in changeable letters, updated just often enough to remind you that someone is in charge of the sign, not often enough to suggest that the person in charge of the sign has a lot of time for it. The church's stability in the background of Springfield is doing something specific. It is serving as a visual anchor for the show's relationship with religion, which is that religion is a constant presence and a constant source of gentle comedy and a constant object of the show's mostly affectionate skepticism, and the building that represents it should look like something that has been there for a very long time and intends to remain for much longer. The bar, Moe's Tavern, is perhaps the building whose background architecture most directly reflects the story the show is telling about it. Moe's is a place of comfort and failure simultaneously. It is where Homer goes to be among people who accept him without requiring him to be better than he is. It is also a business that, by all evidence, is perpetually on the verge of some kind of ruin. The exterior of Moe's reflects this dual nature. The sign is always slightly off, a letter missing, and illumination failing. The exterior walls are the color of a building that was painted a long time ago and then given up on. The door is the door of a place that takes its function seriously, even if it takes its aesthetics less so. It opens onto something warm, the show always implies. The outside is rough, but the inside is the inside, and that matters. And then there is the Simpson house itself. 742 Evergreen Terrace has been one of the most analyzed buildings in popular culture history, and most of that analysis focuses on the famous question of how a nuclear plant worker on a single income can afford a house of this size. But the background details of the house are where the more interesting story lives. The crack in the driveway that appears in some episodes and not others. The way the kitchen looks slightly different depending on which season you are in. Small updates that were made to the set design over the years that the show never acknowledged in the narrative, but that create a subtle sense of the house as a place that is being lived in and gradually modified by the people who live in it. The living room couch that has subtly changed its shade of color across decades. The kitchen wallpaper that has shifted in pattern in ways that are too small to notice in any individual episode, but become visible when you compare early and late season frames side by side. These are not errors. These are the visual equivalent of what actually happens to a house when a family lives in it for a long time. Things get replaced. Colors shift. The house becomes, over 36 years, a slightly different house than it started as, while remaining, always, the house on Evergreen Terrace where the Simpsons live. And the neighborhood that surrounds it carries its own hidden story. The other houses on Evergreen Terrace are never fully mapped, never completely described. They are glimpsed in background scenes, the same few facades appearing and reappearing as the establishing shot for the neighborhood, and those facades have their own quiet details. The house 3 doors down that always has a car in the driveway that you never see move. The house across the street with the garden that is always slightly overgrown in summer episodes and always has the same sparse winter appearance in cold weather episodes, the plants dying back and not quite recovering. The tree at the corner of the Simpsons property that has, over the seasons, grown slightly taller in background establishing shots, the kind of growth that no single episode would mark, but that becomes visible when you look across decades. Springfield's architecture is doing what all background art does at its best. It is building a world that feels inhabited and specific and real, in ways that the story never needs to directly address, so that when the story does happen, it is happening inside something that already feels true. The kitchen table at 742 Evergreen Terrace has a newspaper on it in a remarkable number of episodes. Homer brings it in from the porch. Marge reads it at breakfast. It sits folded by the fruit bowl. It gets used as a placemat. It is, in the visual grammar of the Simpsons household, as constant a presence as the couch and the refrigerator and the stack of mail that never quite gets dealt with. And in almost every episode where the newspaper appears, it has a headline. A specific, legible, if you pause and look headline that tells you something about what is happening in Springfield at the time of this episode that the episode itself is not necessarily going to address. This is one of the densest and most rewarding categories of Simpsons background detail, and also one of the most overlooked, because the headlines are rarely on screen long enough to read at normal playback speed. They are there for a second, sometimes 2, while the scene is happening in the foreground. The newspaper is set dressing. The headline is the part of the set dressing that the production team could not resist making specific. The Springfield Shopper, which is the paper of record for Springfield and presumably the paper that ends up on the Simpsons' kitchen table, has over the course of the show's run generated a body of journalism that constitutes its own alternate history of Springfield. The headlines document events that the show has never dramatized directly. They reference political situations in Springfield that exist only in the newspaper's background presence. They announce outcomes of stories that the show told many episodes ago and then moved past. They preview stories that the show will tell in future episodes without knowing it, because the writers put a headline in the background of an early episode for fun and then, seasons later, return to the story it implied. The most interesting category of shopper headline is the kind that describes a Springfield event in a register that is completely disproportionate to the event's actual significance. A very minor local incident is described in the shopper with the vocabulary of a genuine crisis. A city council decision about parking meters gets a headline written as though it will alter the course of civilization. This is a joke about local newspaper coverage, which has always had a tendency towards civic drama, but it is also a background-level portrait of Springfield as a place that takes its own small dramas very seriously. The town is not unaware that parking meters are not world historical, but the shopper covers the story as though it might be, because this is the town's paper, and the town's paper covers the town's stories with the full weight of its attention, regardless of whether that weight is warranted. There are also shopper headlines that exist in direct tension with the foreground story of the episode they appear in. An episode in which the Simpsons family is having a perfectly ordinary day might have a shopper headline visible in the background that describes something catastrophic happening elsewhere in Springfield, not the kind of catastrophic that will become the episode's plot, just a parallel catastrophe happening in the same town at the same time that the story never addresses. Springfield is a place where multiple things are always happening simultaneously. Most of those things are in the background. The newspaper is one of the few background elements that actually names them. The shopper's sports section appears in background shots when the paper is folded to the inside pages, and the sports headlines have their own internal logic. Springfield's sports teams have a long and mostly undistinguished history, and the sports section covers this history with the kind of determined optimism that characterizes coverage of teams that rarely win but are very much loved. There are background headlines about the Springfield Isotopes, the town's minor league baseball team, that describe losses in vocabulary borrowed from descriptions of heroic last stands. There are headlines about the high school sports teams that treat a sophomore's field goal as the kind of achievement worth archiving. These are not jokes at the expense of the sports section. They are portraits of a particular kind of civic journalism, the kind that knows its job is to make a community feel seen and present and worth caring about, and does that job even when the material does not make it easy. The shopper has also, over the years, served as a vehicle for commentary on actual events, real news events, real political moments, real cultural shifts translated into the Springfield idiom. These headlines are usually subtle enough that a viewer who does not know the specific reference will still find the headline plausible as Springfield news. But a viewer who does know the reference gets an additional layer of the joke. The paper exists on both levels simultaneously, as the legitimate newspaper of a fictional American town and as a filtered commentary on the real American world that Springfield is always reflecting. And then there are the shopper headlines that seem to be talking to the viewer directly. These are the ones that describe something so specifically strange, so specifically wrong, so specifically Springfieldian that they have no real-world referent and no in-episode narrative function. They exist purely as background text that some writer put there because it seemed true about Springfield. Local man unclear on details of most things is a headline that the show did not need to put in the background of any episode. It serves no narrative purpose. It makes no point that the foreground is not already making about Homer Simpson specifically and Springfield generally. And yet there it is, in a background shot, legible if you pause and look, a piece of Springfield journalism that exists only for the viewer who slows down enough to find it. This is the gift of the background newspaper. It does not explain itself. It does not wave at the camera. It sits on the kitchen table and waits, headline up, in the half second before the camera moves on, offering its small piece of Springfield journalism to anyone who is paying close enough attention to receive it. The act of reading these headlines changes the experience of watching the show. When you know they are there, when you start watching for the paper on the kitchen table, the background of the Simpsons household becomes a kind of ticker, a constant low-level feed of Springfield news running beneath the main story. The episode is about one thing. Springfield is simultaneously about many other things. The newspaper is the proof. Springfield has more signs per square visual foot than almost any other town in the history of animated television, and most of those signs say things that nobody is supposed to read. This is not quite accurate, of course. Someone is supposed to read them. The production team put the words on the signs, which means the production team intended for the words to be there, which means they were written for some audience. But that audience is not the average viewer watching at normal speed, catching the sign in the corner of the frame for the half second before the camera moves on. That audience is the viewer who pauses, the viewer who watches again, the viewer who is thinking about the background. Springfield's storefronts have been the site of some of the densest wordplay in the show's history. The pun density in Springfield's commercial district is remarkable. Every other storefront seems to have a name that is both a functional description of the business and a joke operating at a different frequency. A florist called the Pedal Pusher, a law office called Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe, which is an old joke but one the show deploys with such commitment that it feels newly right for Springfield. A mattress store called I Can't Believe It's Not Mattresses. These jokes reward the viewer who reads the sign and has the second it takes for the pun to register. They punish nobody. They are simply there, in the background, waiting. But the puns are only the surface layer of Springfield's signage. The deeper layer is the signs that make claims that are impossible to verify or to refute. A hardware store that claims to be Springfield's friendliest since 1987, which raises the question of what event in 1987 caused the store to begin its era of friendliness, and what the hardware retail experience in Springfield was like before that. A dry cleaner that promises stains removed while you wait, which is technically what all dry cleaners promise, but which here, with the emphasis placed on the while you wait, seems to be making a slightly anxious point about not wanting to be left alone with the stains. A diner whose sign simply says open in lettering so large and so prominent that the sign is clearly doing more than communicating business hours. It is a declaration. It is a diner that needs you to know it is open the way a person needs you to know they are still there. The billboards of Springfield are where the show most directly comments on the consumer economy. Springfield's roadside billboards, visible through car windows and in exterior shots, advertise products and services that the show has invented for the purposes of these background gags. The products are always just slightly wrong. The pitches are always slightly off in a way that real advertising is never quite off too honest in the wrong places, too evasive in the right ones. A beer billboard that lists the beer's ingredients with what appears to be genuine concern. A fast food billboard whose slogan raises more questions than it answers. A insurance company billboard that seems to be warning you about the insurance company rather than selling it. These are comments on advertising that the show makes from within a commercial context. The Simpsons is itself a product, itself advertised, itself inserted into the same commercial stream. It is critiquing, and the billboards are where that critique lives most clearly. They are in the background, they pass by. They are not the subject of any scene. And they contain, in the half second you have to read them, a fairly precise analysis of how consumer culture speaks and what it is trying to not say. The neighborhood signs in Springfield also do a lot of the town's social mapping work. The sign at the entrance to the wealthy neighborhood where the Simpsons sometimes venture is designed differently from the signs elsewhere in Springfield. It is cleaner, more formal, using a typeface that communicates something about permanence and taste, and the particular kind of civic pride that comes from having the resources to invest in a good sign. The sign at the entrance to the rundown neighborhood on the other side of the tracks is doing something different. It is weathered, the lettering slightly faded, the information accurate but presented with the minimum of ceremony that the budget allows. The show does not need to tell you about economic inequality in Springfield. The signs tell you. There is also the matter of the temporary signs. Springfield hosts a remarkable number of special events, festivals, fairs, elections, community meetings, and each event gets its own signage, and that signage is always specific and always slightly wrong in the particular way that community signage is always slightly wrong. The letters are never quite aligned. The color choices are enthusiastic but not coordinated. The message is clear, but the execution suggests it was produced under time pressure by someone who had access to a banner and a marker and a reasonable amount of civic goodwill. These temporary signs are among the most specifically human details in the show's entire visual vocabulary. They look exactly like real temporary signs made by real people with limited resources and unlimited enthusiasm. The menus at Springfield's restaurants deserve their own attention. Whenever a scene is set in a diner or a restaurant and the camera briefly catches the menu is specific. The prices are Springfield prices. which bear approximately the same relationship to actual prices that Springfield geography bears to actual geography, recognizable but not quite right. The items are the items you would expect at a Springfield diner, but with small additions that the show cannot resist. A dish described with slightly too much detail, a dessert whose description suggests it was written by someone who felt strongly about it, a special that is written with the kind of urgency that makes you feel slightly pressured to order it, even though you came in planning to get the burger. And the store signs in the background of Bart's neighborhood walks, the signs visible from the school bus, the signs in the parking lot of the mall. These are the signs that are doing the atmospheric work. They are not making jokes. They are building a specific visual environment of a specific American town, at a specific American income level, in a specific American era. And they are doing this work frame by frame, season by season, in the background of a show that is mostly about a family trying to get along and occasionally failing in ways that work out fine in the end. The signs of Springfield are the town's public voice. They are where the town speaks to itself about what it is and what it values and what it hopes people understand about it. And the town's public voice, as rendered in the background of 36 years of episodes, is consistently funny and consistently human and consistently full of small moments that the story does not need, but the town does. There is a category of Simpsons joke that technically occupies the foreground of the frame, but that most viewers never process as a joke, because it is happening at the same time as something louder and more obvious in the audio track. These are the visual gags. The jokes that exist entirely in what you see rather than what you hear. The sight gag that runs in the background while a character is delivering a verbal punchline, so that viewers who are listening for the punchline get one joke, and viewers who are also watching the frame get two. This practice of layered comedy is one of the most distinctive things about the way The Simpsons was constructed in its peak years, and it was deliberate. The writing staff and the animation team were staffed with people who came from different comedy traditions, and those traditions interacted in specific ways. The verbal jokes were the foundation. But the visual comedy was built on top of the verbal comedy, added in the animation stage, creating a second tier of joke that operated at a different frequency. Some of these visual gags are famous. The Troy McClure background filmography, the items on the shelves in the Quickie Mart, the signs in the background of the hospital. These have been cataloged and discussed, but the less famous ones are in some ways more interesting, because they are the ones that were not designed to be found. They were placed in the background as a kind of present for whoever happened to be paying attention, and the expectation was always that most people would not be paying attention to that part of the frame at that moment. Consider the visual gags that play out entirely in the background during talking scenes. Two characters are in the foreground having a conversation. The audio is entirely about that conversation. And in the background, visible if you know to look, a completely separate scene is occurring. Not a parallel conversation, a physical event. Something is happening to someone who is not part of the foreground scene. A person is walking into a fire hydrant. A dog is very slowly stealing something from an unattended table. A child is climbing something that it is clearly not safe to climb. These background events begin and end during the foreground conversation, complete small narrative arcs that the foreground scene is entirely unaware of, and then conclude and are never referenced. This is comedy of a specific and demanding kind. It requires the viewer to split attention between two simultaneous events, neither of which knows the other is happening. It requires trust that the viewer is capable of seeing the background while processing the foreground. And it is most effective on repeat viewings, when the foreground scene is already known and the viewer's attention is free to migrate to the background and catch what was there all along. There is also the category of visual gag that works by duration. Something starts happening in the background of a scene. It is briefly funny, the situation is clearly going to get worse, and the scene continues, the foreground conversation continues, and in the background the situation keeps getting worse at a steady pace, and the joke keeps building, and the show's audio never acknowledges it, and by the time the scene ends, the background event has reached a conclusion that is either extremely dramatic or extremely understated, given how long it has been developing, and the foreground characters depart without any awareness that any of it happened. The visual gags that work by duration are the show at its most formally patient. They require the animation team to maintain a coherent physical comedy in the background over an extended period, which is more demanding than a quick sight gag. and they require the viewer to have been watching the background from the beginning of the scene, which is not the default viewing mode. They are, in a very specific sense, the most private jokes in the show's history, accessible only to the viewer who decided, at the exact right moment, to look at the wrong part of the frame. Homer's physical comedy in the background of other characters' scenes is also worth attention. There are scenes in which another character is the protagonist. Marge has a scene, or Lisa or Bart and Homer is visible in the background, and Homer is doing something that deserves its own scene but is not getting one. Not dialogue, not narrative importance, just Homer being physically somewhere and having a physical experience that is happening outside the frame of the current story. These moments are among the show's most affectionate portraits of Homer. He is not performing for anyone. He is not the subject of the scene. He is just Homer, in the background, being himself, and what being himself involves in these moments is a remarkable variety of small physical misfortunes and recoveries, and continued misfortunes that accumulate into something that is funnier than almost anything he does in the foreground. The visual gag category also includes what might be called impossible objects, items that appear in the background of Springfield scenes that should not be there, that violate the laws of physics or the logic of the environment, that are present and visible and never explained. A piece of furniture that is clearly too large to have come through the door of the room it is in. A vehicle parked in a space that is demonstrably not large enough to contain it. A stack of objects that is defying gravity by a small but unambiguous margin. These are not animation errors, although they can look like errors at first. They are visual gags that have disguised themselves as errors, a form of comedy that asks the viewer to first notice the wrongness, then recognize it as deliberate, then appreciate the skill of making the deliberate look accidental. And then there are the visual gags that operate as pure visual poetry moments in the background, where something is arranged in a way that is beautiful or strange or both, where the composition of the background suggests a kind of care that the story does not require, but the animators provided anyway. A shadow that falls across a wall in a way that briefly creates a different image. A reflection in a window that shows something the main frame does not. The specific way that light is entering a room at a particular angle, catching a particular object, suggesting something about the quality of time in Springfield that the verbal story has no language for. These are the moments when the background becomes genuinely cinematic, when the joke has given way to something else, when the animators were not just populating the background for verisimilitude, but finding beauty in it, in the specific way that an artist working in a commercial context sometimes finds space, even in the margins of a large and profitable franchise, to make something that is purely about seeing. There is another dimension to the chalkboard gags that has to do with what happens in the space between the writing and the reading. The gap that exists for every viewer who watches Bart write the sentence, but does not actually process the words because the scene is moving and the music is playing, and the familiar ritual of the opening is functioning as a signal rather than a message. This gap is where the chalkboard gag lives most fully. It is designed for the repeat viewer, the pausing viewer, the viewer who has seen the opening so many times that the ritual has become automatic and can therefore be replaced, on any given viewing, with actual attention. The first time you watch an episode, the chalkboard sentence is part of the flow. The 10th time, you might slow down. The 20th time, you might pause and read. And what you find when you finally read carefully is that the sentence has been there all along, waiting with the patience of text, saying its specific thing at the start of an episode that may or may not be connected to what the sentence is saying. Because the chalkboard sentence and the episode that follows it are not always about the same thing. This is one of the subtler pleasures of reading them carefully over time. Sometimes there is a direct connection. The sentence describes an infraction that the episode's plot will somehow illuminate, or the theme of the sentence mirrors a theme the episode will develop. But often there is no connection at all. The sentence is about one thing. The episode is about something else entirely. They coexist in the same opening without making contact. Two separate pieces of Springfield story running in parallel. The way Springfield stories often run simultaneously, without acknowledging each other. The chalkboard gag as a physical object deserves some attention. Bart is writing on an actual chalkboard, with actual chalk. This technology, the chalkboard, as a disciplinary surface, the chalk as the instrument of public correction, was already becoming somewhat archaic by the time the show began in 1989. and it has become more so with every passing year. Schools move to whiteboards, then to smartboards, then to surfaces that are not boards at all but screens. But Bart has been writing on that chalkboard for 36 years. The medium of his punishment is the medium of his grandfather's punishment, and his great-grandfather's punishment, and the punishment of every child who was ever made to write something repeatedly on a hard surface, as the school's way of saying, "We have noted your behavior, and we are directing your body to perform repetition as a form of contrition." The archaic quality of the punishment is part of what the show is saying. Springfield Elementary has not updated its disciplinary technology because Springfield Elementary has not really updated anything. It uses the tools that were already there when the building was built. It is institutional in the specific way that institutions that have been running a long time without being substantially reformed are institutional, not malevolent, not particularly thoughtful, just continuing to do the things it has always done because the things it has always done have not produced consequences serious enough to require change. Bart writing on the chalkboard is Springfield's institutional continuity made visible. It is the school saying, "This is how we handle this. We have always handled this way. We will continue to handle this way." The chalk against the board is the sound of an institution maintaining itself through repetition, which is, when you think about it, almost exactly what Bart is being asked to demonstrate. And yet Bart writes. Every episode, the sentence is there. He does not refuse. He does not write something different. He writes what has been assigned, in his developing handwriting, across however many lines the board has space for. And when the scene moves on, the board is full of his particular contrition, whatever it is this time, accumulated in chalk across the green surface that the school has provided for exactly this purpose. There is something almost meditative about it when you set aside the comedy and look at the image plainly. A child at a board writing a sentence, the sentence repeating, the chalk moving, the board filling. The writers have used the chalkboard across the show's run to respond to things happening in the production of the show itself, casting changes, network disputes, contract negotiations in ways that were almost certainly not legible to most viewers, and were most likely there for the production team's own private satisfaction. The chalkboard was the one place in the show where something could be said that was not quite part of the story, where the people making the show could speak directly out of the fiction's frame for approximately 4 seconds at the beginning of an episode, knowing that almost nobody would be paying close enough attention to receive it. This is the most intimate category of chalkboard gag, the ones addressed to an audience that the show was not quite sure existed. And the fact that they kept making them, kept putting things in the chalkboard that were personal or self-referential, or pointed at real situations happening outside the animation studio is a kind of faith. Faith that somewhere, in some future viewing, someone would pause at the right moment and read the sentence and understand that it was not just Bart being funny, that it was someone saying something that needed to be said in the only 4 seconds per episode where the fiction stepped back long enough for a real word to get through. The couch gags that are most often cited, most often replicated in best-of compilations, are the ones that are formally spectacular. The Banksy gag, the Guillermo del Toro gag, the epic historical panorama gags that trace the history of the couch from the origins of the universe to the present. These are extraordinary pieces of animation and deserve every bit of the attention they receive. But the couch gags that tell the deepest story about what the show has been doing are the quiet ones, the ones that seem almost too small to comment on. A gag where the family runs in and finds the couch in the wrong position and spends the entire gag trying to move it back. A gag where one member of the family arrives slightly too late and the couch has already been claimed by the others and the latemer has to find another place to sit. A gag where the couch is there but something about the room is wrong, not the couch, not the family, but the room around them, which has been slightly rearranged, the geometry subtly off, and the family does not notice. These small gags are doing something that the spectacular gags do not do. They are doing it from inside the domestic space rather than from outside it. They are finding strangeness in the living room rather than importing strangeness from elsewhere. And the strangeness they find is the strangeness of familiarity, the moment when something you have seen so many times suddenly looks different. When the couch you have been running to for decades is in a slightly wrong position, and the wrongness of that position is more disorienting than any external catastrophe could be. Because the couch was the one fixed point. The couch gag where Homer arrives last and finds no room is an underrated piece of Simpsons storytelling. It lasts approximately 4 seconds. It does not affect the episode that follows. Homer arrives late and the couch is full and the family looks at him and the gag ends. But in those 4 seconds, something about Homer's relationship with the family, his particular combination of beloved and extraneous, of central and peripheral, of the person the family revolves around, and the person the family occasionally does not leave space for, is expressed more precisely than several full episodes have managed. The couch gags that make explicit reference to the show's own longevity have a different emotional register than the ones that simply play with the couch as a physical object. When a couch gag acknowledges that the family has been running to this couch since 1989, when it counts the number of times they have made this run, when it shows them running toward the couch while simultaneously acknowledging that the run is a ritual that has acquired its own history, these gags are the show looking in the mirror while in motion. They are acknowledging the loop they are in without breaking it, which is the most specifically Simpsons thing possible. The show can see itself. It can even comment on what it sees. But it will continue anyway, because the run is the run, and the couch is the couch, and the opening credits will always end with the family arriving. There are also couch gags that take the family outside Springfield and then bring them back. Gags that suggest the living room on Evergreen Terrace is one of many possible living rooms in one of many possible universes. That the Simpsons family is a repeating pattern rather than a specific family. That the couch is an archetype as much as a piece of furniture. These gags are gesturing towards something that the regular episodes cannot engage with directly. The strangeness of a fictional world that has been so thoroughly imagined for so long that it has started to feel like it might be a real place rather than a set of creative decisions. The couch gag has been the space where the show can acknowledge this strangeness, the strangeness of having been real, in the imaginary sense, for 36 years without disrupting the story that follows. The Springfield nuclear power plant is the most architecturally present building in the show, not because it takes up the most screen time in any individual scene, but because it is always there. In establishing shots of Springfield, it is visible on the horizon. In scenes set in the town center, its cooling towers can be seen through windows and between buildings. From the Simpson house on Evergreen Terrace, on the days when the wind comes from the right direction, it is the dominant feature of the visible skyline. This omnipresence is a visual argument that the show makes continuously and without commentary. The power plant is everywhere. It is the thing you cannot not see in Springfield. It is in the background of the background, present even when no scene takes place within its walls, defining the visual context of the town the way a mountain range defines the visual context of a valley. You do not need to be at the plant to be in the plant's shadow. Everyone in Springfield is always in the plant's shadow. The specific visual design of the plant, the 2 cooling towers, the industrial gray of the facility, the fencing, the warning signs is a design that was chosen to be immediately legible as dangerous infrastructure. Viewers who know what a nuclear power plant looks like recognize it immediately. Viewers who do not know still read the visual language of the building correctly. This is a large industrial thing that the town has organized its skyline around. And large industrial things that towns organize their skylines around are the things that the towns are most dependent on and most unable to escape from. The plant does not need a label in most shots. Its architecture makes its nature clear. The Springfield Water Tower is a different kind of architectural landmark, one that appears in the background of many outdoor scenes and that serves as a consistent orientation marker within the otherwise impossible geography of the town. It is the fixed star of Springfield's visual landscape. When you see the water tower, you know roughly where you are in the town, even if the town's internal geography makes precise location difficult. The water tower is the show's way of telling you, this is still Springfield. You are still in the right place. The way that Springfield's buildings have been maintained or not maintained across the show's run tells a story about public investment and private neglect that the show never addresses directly, but that the background makes evident. The public buildings, the school, the library, the town hall, all show a pattern of deferred maintenance that is specifically consistent with under-resourced municipal institutions. The paint is not fresh, the signage is not updated. The infrastructure works broadly because it was built well enough to continue working without attention, but the attention that would make it work better, work more beautifully, work in ways that would tell the residents that the community values these spaces is not there. And then there are the private buildings of Springfield's wealthier areas, which look different. Not dramatically different. This is Springfield, not Monaco. But the specific differences between a maintained private building and a neglected public one are visible in the background of the appropriate scenes. The Flanders house is slightly tidier than the Simpson house, which is slightly tidier than the houses in the parts of Springfield where the show does not spend much time. These gradations are the show's visual map of Springfield's economic geography, as precise as any explicit statement could be, and completely silent. The Springfield Shopper's editorial voice is one of the most consistent and overlooked comedic achievements in the show's background. There is a specific register that local American newspapers have historically occupied, a register defined by the belief that local events deserve the same gravity of coverage as national ones, that the appointment of a new parks commissioner warrants the same careful, serious prose that a presidential election would warrant, that the opening of a new restaurant is the kind of story that merits a full-length feature with multiple sources and a historical overview of the dining scene. The Shopper inhabits this register faithfully and earnestly. Its headlines are written by some fictional Shopper editor, permanently off-screen, who believes deeply in the importance of what they are covering, regardless of what that thing is. When a Springfield high school athletic team has a mediocre season, the Shopper does not dismiss this. It covers the season with the full weight of its attention. The headlines are not satirical from the inside. They are the sincere product of a local journalism culture that takes local stories seriously because local stories are what local people live. The comedy comes from the outside. From the viewer looking at a headline written with complete sincerity about something that the viewer's broader perspective allows them to find funny. The Shopper is not in on the joke. The Shopper is the most dedicated local paper in Springfield, which means it is the most dedicated local paper in a town where dedication to local coverage produces results that are consistently, specifically, deeply funny. The background placement of the Shopper in the Simpsons household also does something about the family's relationship with their own community. The paper is in the house. It arrives. It gets placed on the kitchen table. Sometimes it is read. More often, it is moved from one flat surface to another, contributing to the ambient clutter of a household in the specific way that periodical publications always contribute to household clutter present, technically attended to, in practice mostly just there. The Simpsons family is the kind of family that gets the paper. They are not the kind of family that reads the paper with systematic attention. They are the kind of family that means to read the paper, and sometimes does read the paper, and often uses the paper as a surface, and occasionally throws the paper away, and then, the next morning, there is a new paper, because the subscription is still running, and the cycle continues. This is exactly right for the family, and for the town. Springfield gets the news. Springfield has a local paper that produces the news. The news is present in the home. The relationship between the news and the household is the relationship that most households have with their news. Adjacent, glancing, partly absorbed, often not really. The Shopper's background headlines are there for the viewer who pays closer attention to the news than the Simpsons family typically does, which is a comment both on the family and on the kind of viewer the show is addressing when it puts a legible headline in the background of a kitchen scene. There are also headlines in the Shopper that appear to track the long-term arc of Springfield's civic life across multiple episodes, as though the paper is covering an ongoing story that the episodes themselves only visit occasionally. A headline in one episode refers to an investigation that is ongoing. A later headline, in a different episode, refers to the conclusion of what appears to be the same investigation or possibly a different investigation with a similar character, since Springfield's civic life has always had a consistent quality of perpetual scandal that never quite resolves. These connections across episodes are probably not intentional in most cases, but the effect of the Shopper's consistent presence over decades is that it creates the impression of a continuous local journalism operation, covering a continuous local story, and the reader who has been paying attention for long enough can sometimes see the threads. The category of Springfield sign that deserves the most careful attention is the one that describes itself. The sign that uses its own existence as part of its message. Sign not readable from road, posted on a sign that is barely readable from the road. This space intentionally left blank posted on a billboard that is not blank at all, because the declaration of blankness has filled it. Under new management. Since 1987, which is technically new management, if you take a long enough view of what constitutes newness, these signs are doing something philosophically ambitious for pieces of commercial signage. They are being honest about the conventions of the medium they are participating in. They are signs that know they are signs. And in being honest about this, they expose something about the whole enterprise of commercial signage, the way it addresses you, the way it makes claims, the way it constructs a reality that it would like you to accept. The self-aware Springfield sign is the background equivalent of the show's broader, formal self-awareness. The capacity to see itself clearly and comment on what it sees while continuing to do the thing it is commenting on. The Quickie Mart's internal signage is a micro-environment of commercial communication that the show has populated with remarkable consistency over 36 years. The handwritten special signs above certain products. The printed corporate signage that Apu is required to maintain. The small, unofficial signs that appear to have been added by a previous employee or by a customer or by some process of accretion that the store's current management has simply stopped trying to reverse. The Quickie Mart contains multiple overlapping layers of signage: corporate, local, unofficial, handwritten, printed, faded, new, that together produce the specific visual texture of a franchise location that has been continuously operated for long enough to have developed its own microculture. This layering is accurate. Real convenience stores, real small retail operations that have been running continuously for decades develop exactly this kind of visual palimpsest. The corporate branding from multiple eras coexisting. The handwritten signs that were added when the printer was broken and never removed when the printer was fixed. The faded sticker from a promotion that ended years ago still adhering to the refrigerator door because the effort of removing it never quite justified itself. The Quickie Mart's background signage is one of the most carefully observed pieces of retail environment in the show's entire visual vocabulary. The roadside of Springfield, specifically the stretch of highway that the show uses as background when characters are driving, has been lined with billboards and signs that constitute their own visual environment. This is the Springfield that nobody walks through the commercial strip designed for cars, for speed, for glances rather than reading. And the signs that inhabit this strip are designed for exactly that relationship with their audience. They are big. They are simple. Their messages are compressed to the few words that can be processed at driving speed. And yet the show fills them with content anyway, because the show cannot help itself. Even at billboard scale, even in the format that permits the least information, the production team found ways to say things. The seasonal variation in Springfield's commercial signage is also worth noting. The town's storefronts change their window displays according to the season, and these changes happen in the background of seasonal episodes with the consistency of a real commercial district responding to the calendar. This is an enormous amount of visual production work that most viewers never register. The animators are drawing a different window display for the autumn episode than they drew for the summer episode, and the new window display is specific autumn merchandise, specific autumn colors, the specific commercial aesthetics of a season transition that anyone who has walked past a Main Street storefront will recognize. This specificity is the show being generous with details that nobody is required to notice, because that is what the show does. The category of Simpsons visual gag that operates through accumulation is one of the show's most particular pleasures. A single background element is planted early in an episode, not as a flag joke, just as a detail in the visual environment. The episode continues. The element reappears, slightly changed. The episode continues. The element reappears again, changed further in the same direction. By the third appearance, a viewer who has been tracking the element has assembled a complete visual story that the episode's audio has never referenced. The accumulation gag is a story told entirely in the background of another story, constructed from fragments that individually look like details and collectively reveal themselves as a plot. This technique requires a viewer who is paying a specific kind of attention, not the attention of someone watching a show, the attention of someone looking at a painting, the willingness to scan the whole frame, to register what is in the corners, to return to details that seemed incidental and reassess them in light of subsequent developments. The Simpsons has been rewarding this kind of attention since its earliest seasons, which is why the show continues to yield discoveries even after hundreds of viewings. There are accumulation gags that viewers have not assembled yet because they have not been looking at the right corner of the right episode at the right moment. They are there, they are waiting. The visual gag that the show uses most generously is the one that lives in expressions. The show is excellent at drawing faces, and excellent faces are where the show's most precise emotional comedy lives. Not the broad expressions, the shock, the happiness, the anger. These are the expressions that are in the foreground, attached to the dialogue, doing the work the scene requires. The subtle expressions are in the background, on faces that the scene does not need. The specific shade of polite discomfort on a face in a crowd when a situation becomes slightly too personal, the particular way someone's expression shifts when they overhear something they were not meant to hear. The look on a background character's face when the main character does something that the background character clearly finds baffling but has decided is not worth addressing. These expressions are among the show's most human moments. They are the expressions of people having private reactions to public events, the specific emotional transactions that happen in all of us when the world does something that we process internally rather than vocally. The show has been drawing these private reactions onto background faces for decades, trusting that some viewers will look at those faces and recognize something true in what they see. The visual gag that resides in the relationship between foreground and background action, where the foreground is doing one thing and the background is doing the opposite, is the show's most structurally interesting. Category of background comedy. A foreground scene about order has a background component that is about chaos. A foreground scene about success has a background component that is quietly documenting failure. These juxtapositions are never pointed. The show does not nudge you toward them. They are simply there, the background telling a different story than the foreground, without making any claim on your attention. When these juxtapositions work at their best, they produce a sensation that is genuinely specific to the experience of watching something very closely. The feeling of suddenly seeing the shape of two stories at once, the foreground and the background resolving into a single larger image that neither of them would produce alone. This is a pleasure that is difficult to name because it is primarily visual and primarily structural. It is not quite comedy, not quite poetry, but it is something that the show has been making available in the background of its episodes for 36 years for the viewer who looks. The Simpsons has produced more original music than almost any other television comedy in the history of the medium. Not counting the pop music licenses and the classical music references, the show has composed incidental score for hundreds of episodes, each score requiring original compositions that respond specifically to the visual story of that episode. This body of original composition is vast, and because it exists in the background of the show's audio heard but rarely listened to, experienced but rarely analyzed, it constitutes one of the least appreciated musical archives in popular culture. The incidental music of the early seasons has a specific quality that later seasons have not fully replicated. Alf Clausen's scores for the peak-era episodes have a warmth and an orchestral richness that roots the show in a specific era of television music, the era before digital production streamlined and thinned the sound of incidental score. These scores were performed by live musicians. You can hear it. There is a quality of breath in the recordings, a slight inconsistency that comes from real people playing together in real time, that digital production has largely replaced with precision. This warmth matters for the show's emotional life. The incidental music of the Simpson household, in the peak seasons, sounds like a place you want to be. Not because the music is explicitly sentimental, it is often quite neutral, functional, filling emotional space without demanding that you feel anything specific. But the warmth of the orchestration, the specific quality of live instruments, creates an ambient emotional environment that the household's visual warmth reinforces. The house sounds inhabited. The music sounds human. The combination produces a feeling of domestic presence that the show has always been very good at, and that the music underpins in ways that most viewers feel without identifying. The music that plays over Homer's moments of private reflection the few times per season when Homer has a thought that lasts longer than a moment, when something gets through the insulation of his particular damage and lands with some weight, is always specific and always doing something precise. It is never triumphant. It is rarely sad, exactly. It occupies a middle register that might be described as honest music that acknowledges the weight of the moment without inflating it, that sits with Homer in whatever he is sitting with rather than telling him how to feel about it. These musical moments are the show at its closest to genuine emotional depth, and the music is what makes the depth accessible without making it demanding. A note on watching Springfield slowly. There is a way of watching The Simpsons that most people have never tried, not because it requires special equipment or unusual preparation, but because it requires something that the pace of modern viewing makes counterintuitive. It requires you to watch the same scene more than once, but with your attention directed somewhere different each time. The first time you watch a crowd scene in Springfield, you follow the story. You watch Homer at the microphone. You listen to what he is saying. You follow the camera as it moves through the scene. This is correct. This is the scene as it was designed to be experienced. You get the joke, the story beat, the emotional content. You get what the show was made to give you. The second time you watch that same scene, try this. Do not look at Homer. Let the audio continue. Let Homer's voice fill the frame the way it always does. But let your eyes go somewhere else. To the back row of the crowd. To the window in the background behind the podium. To the sign on the wall that you have seen dozens of times without reading. To the face of the person standing near the exit with the expression that does not match the scene's official emotional register. What you find there, in that second pass, is not different from what you found in the first pass. It is more of what the first pass gave you. More Springfield. More of the town's interior life made visible. More of the thing that 36 years of careful, loving, detail-obsessed production work has been putting in the background of every scene. The Simpsons is the longest-running animated series in American history. Most of what makes it the longest-running animated series in American history is in the foreground, where the jokes are, where the stories are, where Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie live their impossible, permanent, never-changing, always renewed lives. But some of what keeps it generating new discoveries even after hundreds of viewings, even after decades of academic and fan community analysis, even after every major character arc has been documented and every significant episode has been dissected, is in the background, in the details nobody required, in the care that nobody specifically asked for, in the three-eyed fish and the cracked cooling towers and the newspaper headlines and the background couple who is always in the middle of the same argument, and the music that is always choosing to say something specific, and the signs that reward the reader who has a half second and the patience to use it. Springfield is a town that has been hiding in plain sight since 1989. You know where to look for it now. The next time you sit down with an episode, any episode, let the foreground carry the story for a while. Then look away. Look at the walls. Look at the sky outside the window. Look at the face of the person in the crowd who is not speaking. Look at the sign above the door that nobody is reading. Look at the background. Because Springfield has been building something there, frame by frame, season by season, for 36 years. And it built it for you. For the viewer who would eventually slow down long enough to see it, that viewer is you tonight. The Simpsons is one of the most musically sophisticated shows in the history of American television, and most of that sophistication operates entirely below the level of conscious attention. This is intentional. Alf Clausen, who composed for the show for decades, was a classically trained musician with a background in jazz orchestration, and he approached the score not as wallpaper but as a second narrative track running underneath the visible story. The score was telling the same story the visuals were telling, but from a different angle, with a different vocabulary, in a register that went directly to the emotional processing centers of the brain without passing through the analytical ones first. Most viewers know the main theme. It is one of the most recognizable pieces of television music in history. The Danny Elfman composition, bright, slightly chaotic, full of energy and a particular kind of American optimism that is always on the verge of being overtaken by something more complex, has been the show's signature sound since the first episode. It is the sound of Springfield. It is the sound of the family. It means something very specific to anyone who has watched the show with any regularity, and what it means is, we are here. This is the house, things are about to happen, and they will probably work out in a way that is messier than planned, but fundamentally okay. But that is the theme. What happens to the music once the episode begins is a different story. The incidental music of the show, the underscoring that plays beneath scenes, the musical stings that punctuate moments, the full orchestral pieces that accompany significant emotional beats. This music has been doing something very specific for 36 years. It has been commenting, not just setting tone, commenting, making an argument about the scene it is playing under that the scene itself is not making openly. The use of classical music in The Simpsons' background is a case study in this. When a scene calls for a character to move through Springfield in a moment of private reflection, the choice of which piece of classical music plays under that movement is never arbitrary. The show has used pieces whose cultural context does enormous work that the visible story does not need to do explicitly. A scene set at Burns's mansion might have a piece of late romantic orchestral music playing that says something about wealth and decay and the particular loneliness of having arranged your entire life around the maintenance of power. A scene set in the school might have a piece that is formally beautiful but slightly dry, music that is being appreciated from a distance rather than felt, which is a very precise description of how Lisa experiences her intelligence in Springfield, correctly and from outside. These choices require the viewer to know the music, which most viewers do not, consciously. But the emotional information is there regardless. Music communicates affect before it communicates reference. You do not need to know that the piece playing under Burns's entrance is a particular Mahler symphony to feel the weight that the piece carries. The weight comes through. The piece was chosen because it carries that weight, and the weight lands even without the label. The jazz underscore that plays in the background of Springfield's outdoor scenes is doing something similar. There is a specific musical texture associated with Springfield at rest when nobody is in crisis, when the town is just going about its business, and that texture is built from a particular kind of loose, mid-century American jazz that sounds like afternoon light and unremarkable Tuesday afternoons, and the specific feeling of being in a place that is familiar enough to not require your full attention. This music is the sound of Springfield's ordinary life, and it is playing in the background of every scene that depicts ordinary Springfield life so consistently that viewers who have watched the show for years have internalized it without consciously registering it. They know what Springfield at rest sounds like. They just do not know that they know. The musical transitions between scenes are where some of the show's most precise emotional work happens. The transition cue, the brief musical passage that moves you from one scene location to another, has to do a lot in a short time. It has to close the emotional register of the previous scene and open the emotional register of the next one, and it has to do this in approximately 2 seconds. The Simpsons has been making these transitions for hundreds of episodes, and the precision of the musical choices in them is remarkable. A scene that ends in genuine sadness, followed by a transition cue that is not sad, not cheerful exactly, but oriented toward the next thing, forward-looking, the emotional equivalent of taking a breath after crying and looking up at the room you are in. And then the next scene, which is funny, and the funny scene lands correctly because the transition prepared you for the shift without forcing it. This is invisible craft. It is the kind of work that, when it is done well, the viewer never notices because they simply experience the emotional transition as natural. The craft becomes visible only when it is absent, when a show makes a jarring tonal shift without a musical bridge, and the viewer feels the discontinuity. The Simpsons rarely feels discontinuous, and the music is a large part of why. The sound design of the show, the non-musical audio that fills the background of every scene, is equally specific and equally overlooked. Springfield has a sound. It is a combination of ambient elements that recur consistently across episodes. The low hum of traffic, the specific echo of public spaces, the distant sound of the nuclear plant that has become so embedded in the sonic landscape of the town that nobody consciously registers it, but that is always, very quietly, there. This is not accidental. The sound design team made specific choices about what Springfield sounds like when nothing in particular is happening, and those choices have been maintained across decades of production. The Simpsons also uses sound anachronistically in ways that create comedy without any dialogue. A sound effect applied to a wrong kind of action, the noise of a large object breaking that plays over a tiny, fragile thing being handled, is a form of joke that the show has been making since its early seasons. The incongruity between the visual action and the audio commentary on that action is the joke. The sound is lying. And the lie is funny because it is a specific lie, not a generic one. The sound was chosen for its wrongness. There is also the matter of the music that plays on the television in the background of living room scenes. The Simpson family TV is always on, and it is always playing something, and what it is playing is never generic television sound. It is specific. There are recognizable musical signatures of fictional shows, the theme to The Itchy and Scratchy Show, the incidental music from various in-universe programs, and these play in the background of scenes in which nobody is watching television, contributing to the ambient sound design of the Simpsons household. They are doing the work of making the house feel like a lived-in place where the television has been on all day and nobody has turned it off, which is a very specific American domestic texture that the show has always understood and always reproduced accurately. The silence in the show is also worth attending to. The Simpsons is not a silent show. Its audio track is dense with music, dialogue, and sound effects, but the moments of silence, when they occur, are specific and weighted. The show knows how to use quiet the way a good composer knows how to use a rest. A scene that is building towards something emotional will occasionally drop all music and reduce the sound design to the minimum necessary for the visual to breathe. In these moments, the scene expands slightly. The room gets bigger. The emotional content of what is happening fills the space that the music was occupying. And then, when the musical underscoring returns, it is doing so in a space that the silence has prepared, and the emotional landing is more precise because the silence earned it. The show's musical vocabulary has also evolved in ways that mirror the cultural moment of each era. The early seasons have a particular sound, the Alf Clausen orchestral world, that is rooted in a specific era of television composition. As the show moved through the 90s and into the 2000s, the musical palette expanded. Hip-hop references appeared in ways that would have been unthinkable in the first season. Electronic music textures began to appear in incidental score. The sound design of the show's later seasons reflects a world whose sonic environment has changed substantially since 1989, and the show's background audio has changed to match. This is, in its way, one of the most honest things the show does. The story is frozen, nobody ages, nothing permanently changes, but the sound of the world changes around the story. Because the show exists in the real world and the real world moves forward even when Springfield does not. The music in the background of Springfield is a timeline of American popular sound across 3.5 decades, disguised as background incidental music. Section 9. The Treehouse of Horror's Hidden Canon. Every year, The Simpsons does something that it is technically not supposed to do. It suspends its own rules. It sets aside the internal logic that the regular episodes operate by, the logic of Springfield as a specific place with specific laws of cause and effect, and it opens a door to something else. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are described by everyone involved in making them as non-canonical. Nothing that happens in them counts. The characters can die. They can transform. The town can be destroyed. The universe can end. And when the episode is over, the next regular episode will proceed as though none of it happened, because none of it did happen. The Treehouse of Horror is a dream within a dream, a parenthesis within the parenthesis of Springfield's already frozen time. This is the official position, and the official position is correct in the narrow sense that the events of Treehouse episodes do not carry forward into the regular season's continuity. Homer dies in a Treehouse segment. Homer is back in the kitchen next week. The rules are suspended, the deaths are theatrical, and the credits roll on a story that will never have consequences. But there is a different way to read the Treehouse episodes that the official position does not account for, which is that even though the events do not carry forward, the details do. The background details. The specific visual and thematic elements that the Treehouse episodes use to construct their alternative Springfields. And those details, accumulating over 30-plus years of Halloween specials, constitute a secondary Springfield, a shadow version of the town that exists in the background of the background, visible only to viewers who watch the Treehouse episodes as something other than pure entertainment. The Treehouse episodes tend to use Springfield's familiar buildings and locations as the settings for their horror segments, and in doing so, they reveal something about those buildings that the regular episodes keep hidden. The elementary school, placed in a Treehouse context, becomes genuinely menacing. Its proportions, which are slightly wrong in the regular episodes in ways that are barely noticeable, become frankly sinister when the context is horror. The windows that were only a little too narrow in a regular episode become the windows of a building that was designed to keep things in rather than to let light through. The hallways that were only slightly too long reveal themselves, in the horror context, as corridors that might not end. This is the Treehouse episodes doing something sophisticated. They are telling you that the uncanny quality was always there. That the regular Springfield, the one you have been watching for decades in the comfortable context of domestic comedy, has an architecture and a visual grammar that was always slightly off. The horror just removes the veil. The buildings were always like this. The Treehouse episodes are the first time you noticed, because the Treehouse episodes are the first time you were looking for it. The same principle applies to the characters. The Treehouse segments often transform familiar characters into monsters or victims or supernatural entities, and the most effective of these transformations work by identifying something that was already latent in the character's regular season personality and externalizing it. Homer transformed into a werewolf is Homer's capacity for uncontrolled appetite made literal. Bart, as a supernatural creature with powers he does not fully understand, is Bart's sense of himself as categorically different from the rules everyone else follows, made physical. Burns as a vampire is so precisely right that many viewers feel it does not quite count as a transformation. He was already this. The Treehouse episode just put the cape on him. The horror logic of the Treehouse episodes also has a relationship with the radiation theory of Springfield that the regular episodes never quite acknowledge. When the Treehouse segments depict Springfield's water supply, or food supply, or air quality as sources of supernatural transformation, they are doing something that the regular episodes gesture toward but never commit to. The regular episodes will show you the three-eyed fish. They will show you Burns's green glow. They will show you Homer's superhuman recovery from lethal injury. And they will decline to connect these things directly to the nuclear plant's contamination. The Treehouse episodes will tell you a story in which the contamination explicitly produces monsters, and they will place that story in a context that officially does not count, that is officially not real, that is officially just the show playing dress-up in horror costumes. But the story keeps getting told. Every Treehouse special finds another way to tell the story of a town that is being slowly altered by something in its environment, something that makes its residents capable of things that normal human biology should not allow. The non-canonical frame does not dissolve the story, it just provides it with cover. The Treehouse episodes also contain some of the show's most carefully constructed background details, and these details operate differently than background details in regular episodes because the horror context makes them impossible to dismiss as cute production touches. A background sign in a regular Springfield episode can be appreciated as clever wordplay and moved past. A background sign in a Treehouse Springfield, in a setting that is designed to unsettle, reads as potentially significant in a way that regular episode background signs do not. Every detail in a horror context is a potential clue. The Treehouse segments that are pure parody adaptations of specific films, specific literary texts, specific horror tropes have their own background detail economy. These segments are dense, with references to their source material, tucked into the background of scenes that are already playing with recognizable genre conventions. Finding these references is a different kind of reward than finding a Springfield shopper headline. It requires knowledge of the source material. It rewards the viewer who has spent time in both the Simpsons universe and in the horror, science fiction, and literary traditions the show is drawing from. The Treehouse segments also have an emotional honesty that the regular episodes occasionally struggle to reach, precisely because their non-canonical status releases them from the obligation to be reversible. A Treehouse death can be real because it does not have to be recovered from by next week. A Treehouse transformation can go to places that a regular season transformation would have to stop short of, because the Treehouse transformation exists in a space where consequences are allowed to be final. This means the show's relationship with loss, with irreversibility, with the things that cannot be undone, gets expressed most fully in the segments that officially do not count. The Treehouse episodes are where the show goes to feel things it cannot afford to feel in the regular season. And they accumulate. 30-plus years of Treehouse episodes, 30-plus years of alternative Springfields, of familiar characters in horror contexts, of shadow versions of the town's buildings and streets and social structures. Taken together, They constitute a darker version of Springfield that has been running in parallel with the comedy version since 1990. The two versions share the same locations, the same character designs, the same visual vocabulary, but they are oriented differently. The comedy version wants things to be okay in the end. The Treehouse version does not make that promise. It tells you the things that the comedy version can only show you in the background, in the three-eyed fish, in the cracked cooling towers, in the expressions of the background characters, and it tells you plainly, even if only for the duration of a Halloween special. The background of the Treehouse Springfield is the foreground of the story the regular Springfield does not want to tell. Section 10. The minor characters with complete hidden lives. Springfield is populated, over its 36-year run, by hundreds of characters who never get more than a few minutes of screen time in any individual episode. Some of them get recurring presence, some appear only once. But the show, at its best, treats all of them as though they have lives that extend beyond their participation in any given story. And those lives, visible in the details of their brief appearances, are some of the most quietly complete portraits the show has ever produced. Start with Dr. Nick Riviera, who exists in the show as a joke about medical incompetence, his catchphrase, delivered with the enthusiasm of someone who considers enthusiasm a substitute for knowledge, is one of the show's most quotable lines. But if you watch Dr. Nick across his multiple appearances, you notice something. He is not simply incompetent, he is optimistic. He approaches every medical situation with a confidence that is not supported by his knowledge base, but that is entirely genuine. He believes, in every moment of every appearance, that he is doing a good job, that he is helping, that the patient in front of him is fortunate to have someone of his caliber attending to them. This is a more specific and more human portrait than incompetence alone would produce. Dr. Nick is not a fraud who knows he is a fraud. He is a man whose confidence has completely outpaced his competence, which is a very recognizable human condition, and the show deploys it as background comedy while building, across multiple appearances, a full character. The enthusiasm is always there. The outcomes are always questionable. But there is something genuine in the man. Something that wants to be a good doctor the way Springfield wants to be a functional town, and the gap between the wanting and the achieving is where the character lives. Then there is Sideshow Bob's brother, Cecil, who exists primarily to explain something about Sideshow Bob that the show needed to explain where the Terwilliger family resentment comes from, what Sideshow Bob was before he became a villain, what the specific dynamics of a brilliant, damaged family look like from the inside. Cecil is less famous than his brother and appears in fewer episodes, but his presence in those episodes is meticulous. He is not a villain in the same register as Bob. He is something more complicated, a person who has organized his entire adult life around a grievance that is real but that has consumed more of him than the original slight warranted. This is the background story of many real people. Cecil does not take over the world. He manages a dam. He makes a plan. The plan is about his brother, as all his plans are about his brother, and the plan fails, as all plans organized around personal grievance tend to fail, and Cecil goes to prison, and the next time we see him, his brother is there too, and the dynamic between them has the specific texture of two people who have been irritating each other for a very long time, and will probably continue to do so regardless of external circumstances. The Lovejoy family, Reverend Lovejoy, his wife Helen, and their daughter Jessica constitute a minor character constellation that the show has used sparingly but with remarkable precision whenever they appear. Reverend Lovejoy is a man who went into the clergy with, presumably, some degree of genuine calling. Over the years, the daily demands of Springfield's spiritual welfare, which are considerable, have worn that calling down into something flatter. He is still doing the job. He is still standing at the pulpit, still delivering the sermons, still visiting the sick and counseling the troubled. But the passion that probably existed somewhere in the beginning has been replaced by a professional competence that he deploys with the specific emotional flatness of someone who has decided that competence is enough to ask of themselves. His wife Helen's role in the show's background is to represent the particular form of civic judgment that attaches itself to the spiritual institutions of small towns. She is the keeper of social standards. She knows who is living outside those standards, and she has opinions about it. Her opinions are delivered with a pleasantness that does not quite conceal the assessment underneath. She is not malicious. She is vigilant. These are different things, although the people on the receiving end of her vigilance may experience them as similar. Their daughter Jessica's brief appearances are among the show's most precise pieces of character writing. She is the girl that Bart falls for, and she is falling for Bart in a way that he does not quite understand, which is that she is more genuinely troublemaking than he is, and she is using his infatuation as cover for things she wants to do that his reputation will absorb. This is complicated behavior for a minor character. It requires the viewer to hold two things simultaneously: the romantic comedy of Bart's infatuation and the more unsettling observation that Jessica is a girl who grew up in a glass house and learned very early that the best way to do things that glass houses do not permit is to find someone whose house is already broken. Fat Tony's organization occupies a peculiar niche in Springfield's background. The show has a recurring mob presence, organized crime as one of the town's institutional fixtures, like the power plant and the church and the elementary school, operating by its own rules in its own part of the town's social ecosystem. Fat Tony and his associates appear when the story needs them and recede when it does not. But in their recurring appearances, the show builds a consistent portrait of what organized crime in a town like Springfield looks like, which is not very different from the other institutions. The hierarchy is clear. The obligations are clear. The consequences for failing to meet those obligations are clearer in some ways than the consequences in Springfield's other institutions, where failure tends to result in getting sent to the chalkboard rather than anything more permanent. Fat Tony operates by different rules, but he operates with a consistency and a professionalism that the show treats with a kind of respectful comedy. Here is a man who takes his business seriously, even if his business is the kind that does not put up signs. The barflies at Moe's Tavern, not the named ones, but the generic regulars who fill the background of every Moe's scene collectively constitute one of the show's most consistent minor character ensembles. They do not have names in the episodes. They do not have dialogue that the show awards them in any systematic way, but they are there. Every episode set at Moe's has them in the background, in the same seats, with the same approximate postures, and across the show's long run they have become as much a fixture of Moe's as the bar itself. They are the proof that Moe's is a real bar, a place with regulars, a place that has built the specific kind of loyalty that only comes from being a consistent presence in people's lives. Moe might be a terrible bartender in many respects. His bar is clearly not an upscale establishment, but it is a place where the same people show up every day, and that means it is doing something right, even if what it is doing right is simply being there. Mayor Quimby's various aides and associates constitute a minor character world that the show has used to build a portrait of local government that is simultaneously specific and universal. The aide who is always slightly behind in the conversation, taking notes that seem perpetually 3 exchanges out of date. The official whose confidence in the mayor's decisions is unassailable regardless of the decisions themselves. The bureaucrat who has been in municipal government long enough to have made her peace with the gap between civic idealism and daily reality, and who does her job now with the kind of calm professionalism that comes from no longer expecting surprises. These people are the background of Springfield's government. They are the machinery that keeps the dysfunction running at a steady and manageable pace. And then there is the entire ecosystem of Springfield's service industry, the cashiers at the Quickie Mart besides Apu, the waitresses at the diner who appear in the background of booth scenes, the bus drivers and crossing guards and maintenance workers who constitute the invisible infrastructure of any functioning community. These characters exist for a scene, sometimes for less than a scene. But the show consistently renders them with specific physical gestures and expressions that suggest people with internal lives, with private reactions to the strange things that happen in Springfield, with their own quietly developing opinions about a town that asks a great deal of its service workers and does not always notice that it is asking. Springfield would not function without these minor characters. Not just narratively, they provide the stories with context and texture and the sense that the main characters are moving through a fully populated world, but also philosophically. The minor characters of Springfield are the proof that the show's vision of American life is genuinely democratic. The story might belong to the Simpsons family, but the town belongs to everyone who lives in it, named or unnamed, speaking role or background face, and the show has always treated that fact as the foundation of everything it is doing. Section 11. The animation choices that were actually saying something. The Simpsons looks the way it looks for reasons that go beyond aesthetic convenience, and those reasons have been doing work in every episode since 1989 that most viewers have never consciously processed. The character design of Springfield's residents, the yellow skin, the four fingers, the overbites, the specific head shapes is always explained as a cartoon shorthand. These are simplified humans, cartoon humans, and the design choices are the choices of a visual medium that works through exaggeration and reduction. This is true. But it is also true that the specific exaggerations and reductions the show chose are doing something more than simplifying. They are commenting. The yellow skin is the most obvious example. Yellow is not the color of any human ethnicity. It is a neutral, specifically not real color that was chosen because it reads as human without reading as any particular kind of human. The intent was inclusivity, a color that could be everyone's color because it was nobody's specific color. But the yellow skin also does something in the visual grammar of the show that is harder to articulate and more interesting. It marks the Springfield residents as a population. When you see yellow skin in an episode, you know you are looking at a Springfieldian, as distinct from a guest character or a visitor from outside the town, who tends to be drawn with different proportions and more naturalistic coloring. The yellow is a brand. In the most literal sense, it marks the marked. And if you accept the radiation theory of Springfield, the yellow skin reads differently still. It is the color of contamination made visible. It is what you would expect a population to look like if it had been marinating in industrial pollutants for multiple generations. The cartoon justification and the diegetic justification coexist in the same design choice, which is elegant in a way that most viewers experience without naming. The four fingers deserve attention. Four-fingered characters are a convention of American animation that goes back almost to the beginning of the medium. The reduction from 5 fingers to 4 was originally a practical choice. 4 fingers are easier to draw and easier to animate than 5, and in the early days of animation, when every frame was hand-drawn, the economy mattered. The Simpsons inherits this convention and extends it into its entire character population. Every Springfield resident has 4 fingers. Every guest character who comes from outside Springfield, drawn in a more naturalistic style, given more realistic proportions, has 5. This is a continuity detail that the show maintains across decades. It is not just a convention carried forward from the production legacy of animation. It is a consistent distinction being made between the residents of Springfield and everyone else. The 5-fingered world is the normal world. The 4-fingered world is Springfield. And the line between them, visible in the hands of every character who crosses that line, is one of the show's most quietly maintained pieces of visual coding. The way the show handles time of day in its visual grammar is also doing something that most viewers feel without analyzing. Springfield at night looks different from Springfield during the day in ways that are not just color temperature differences. The show's night scenes have a specific visual language, the quality of artificial light, the way shadows accumulate in corners, the particular way that familiar locations become slightly foreign when the ambient conditions change. This is not complicated craft in itself. Every television show handles day and night visually, but The Simpsons uses this visual grammar to do something additional, to signal that the town's internal life is different at night, that the people of Springfield, under the artificial light of their own lamps and streetlights, are doing and being things that the daytime does not fully permit. The show's treatment of dream sequences in the visual register is similarly deliberate. When a character enters a dream or a fantasy, the visual grammar of the show shifts. Not dramatically, this is not a show that uses radical visual disruption to mark interior states. The shift is subtle. Slightly softer edges, slightly different color saturation, a small loosening in the precision of the animation that signals that we are no longer in the world of Springfield as it is, but in the world of Springfield as someone's mind is constructing it. These shifts are small enough that viewers who are not watching closely might not consciously register them, but they register emotionally. The dream sequence feels different because it looks different, and it looks different in the specific ways that dreams look different from waking life. Slightly more beautiful, slightly less precise, slightly more willing to bend the rules of cause and effect. The show's use of close-up is also a communication system that rewards attention. The Simpsons rarely uses extreme close-ups. When it does, the choice is significant. An extreme close-up in The Simpsons is a signal that what the eye is being directed toward is the thing that the scene is actually about, not the conversation, not the action. This face, in this moment, which is feeling something that the show wants you to see before it tells you about it. The close-up frames the emotional truth of the scene and presents it to the viewer directly, trusting that the viewer will read the face correctly before the dialogue explains what is happening. The decision about what the background characters are doing in any given crowd scene is an animation direction choice that has consequences for what the scene communicates. A background crowd that is uniformly attentive to the foreground action signals a different kind of town than a crowd in which individual people are doing different things, having different reactions, occupying their attention differently. The Simpsons consistently chooses the latter. Springfield crowds are not uniform, they are specific. Each background character is having their own specific experience of whatever is happening in the foreground, and those experiences are not always aligned with the foreground's emotional intent. This is the animation equivalent of what a good novelist does with a crowd scene. You do not describe the crowd as a single feeling mass. You find the individual experiences within the crowd and let them exist simultaneously. The animation team of The Simpsons has been doing this for 36 years, populating every crowd scene with specific individual responses, building a visual argument that the community of Springfield is not a hive mind but a collection of people who happen to be in the same place, each of whom is bringing their own history and their own attention and their own private reaction to whatever is happening in front of them. The color palette choices for different Springfield locations also communicate something that the show never states explicitly. The power plant has a specific palette, the colors of industrial infrastructure, of concrete and metal, and the specific green that is the color of something that is not quite right. The school has a different palette, institutional colors, the kind that were chosen to be inoffensive, and have achieved instead a perfect generic cheerlessness. The Simpsons house has the warmest palette in Springfield, the colors of domestic life at its most uncomplicated, the orange couch, the warm kitchen light, the specific yellow of the wallpaper that makes the rooms feel habitable in a way that most Springfield interiors do not. These color choices are the visual equivalent of the music's emotional commentary. They tell you, before any dialogue or action has occurred, what kind of place this is, what kind of feeling is native to it, what emotional key this scene is going to be played in. The color palette is the show's first word in every scene, spoken before the characters open their mouths, communicating something that the dialogue will spend the rest of the scene confirming or complicating. The specific ways in which the animation style has changed across the show's long run is also a visual record that sits underneath the story. The early seasons have a slightly rougher quality, the lines are thicker, the character movements are a little less smooth, the backgrounds have a hand-drawn texture that later seasons have refined away. As the show moved into digital production, the visual quality became more precise, more consistent, the backgrounds more detailed, and the character animation more fluid. This is the natural evolution of animation technology. But there is also something being lost in the refinement. The slight roughness of the early seasons, the specific imprecision of hand-drawn animation, was doing something for the show's warmth that the more precise later animation does not always replicate. The early seasons feel, visually, like something made by people who were still finding out what they were making. The later seasons feel like something made by people who know exactly what they are making and have the technology to make it with perfect consistency. Both are valid, but the visual quality of the early seasons contains, in its specific imprecision, a quality of discovery that is part of what the show felt like when it was still becoming itself. The Treehouse of Horror segments that age best are the ones that take Springfield's own visual vocabulary and push it just far enough that the familiar becomes strange. These are different from the parody segments, which take external references and fit them into the Springfield frame. The best within-universe Treehouse segments find horror already present in the world the show has been building and simply remove the comedy context that normally keeps it at a manageable distance. A segment where Springfield itself becomes threatening, where the streets and buildings of the town that the regular episodes have rendered so specific and so familiar are suddenly inhabited by a different set of rules, is using the show's entire accumulated visual history as its horror resource. Every episode you have seen in which a Springfield street felt safe and familiar is now working against you. The familiarity is the horror. The street looks right because it always looks like this. And it looks like this now, in a context where looking right is the most unsettling thing it could do. This is the treehouse at its most sophisticated, using the bank of associations built up across hundreds of regular episodes to generate unease from things that are, in themselves, only slightly wrong. The cooling towers are always there, the school is always there, the neighborhood is always there. In a treehouse segment, they are still there, still looking the way they always look, and the wrongness is not in them but in what is happening around them, or what is implied about them, or what the horror context reveals that the comedy context was suppressing. There is also a category of treehouse background detail that functions as pure loving tribute to the horror genre the show is working within. The show's animation team are fans. They have seen the films the treehouse segments reference, and in the backgrounds of those segments, in the details of the sets and the visual compositions, they have placed references that reward the viewer who has also seen those films. A background element that mirrors a specific shot from a specific horror film. A set design that echoes a production design choice from a specific director. A color palette that quotes a specific era of horror cinema. These are not essential to understanding the segment. They are gifts to the viewer who can receive them. The Treehouse episodes also have their own internal continuity that runs in parallel with the show's main continuity without intersecting it. Events from one Treehouse episode get referenced in the background of a later one. Background details from early Treehouse episodes are present, slightly modified, in later ones. This internal Treehouse continuity is the show acknowledging that even its non-canonical spaces have accumulated history, that even the space where the rules are suspended has rules that have developed over time, that even the parenthesis has its own internal logic. The teacher characters of Springfield Elementary beyond Mrs. Krabappel, who has the depth of a main character, constitute a minor character world that the show has used to make specific observations about education and the people who choose to work in it. The substitute teachers who cycle through Springfield Elementary across the show's run are particularly interesting because they come from outside and leave after a limited engagement, which gives the show a way to introduce perspectives on Springfield that the permanent residents cannot provide. A substitute teacher sees the school the way an outsider would see it, with clarity about things that the permanent staff has stopped seeing, because familiarity has made those things invisible. The specific absurdity of Springfield Elementary's educational culture is most legible through the eyes of people encountering it for the first time, and the show has used substitute teacher characters to make observations about the school's dysfunction that the regular teachers who are inside the dysfunction cannot make. The school's administrative staff, the office workers, the custodial staff, the cafeteria workers are a minor character world that the show has populated with the same care it brings to the classroom. Groundskeeper Willie is the most developed of these, having accumulated enough presence across multiple seasons to qualify as a genuine character with a consistent voice and a specific worldview. But even the background cafeteria workers, the ones who ladle the unidentifiable hot dish onto trays without speaking, have a visual consistency and a physical presence that suggests the animators thought about who these people are, what their relationship to the school is, what their day is like, even if none of that thinking ever made it into a line of dialogue. The retirement castle community, Grandpa's neighbors and companions, constitutes one of the show's most specific minor character worlds. The retirement castle is a place the show visits regularly and has populated with faces that are consistent across multiple episodes. These are people whose situation the show handles with more care than you might expect from a comedy, people who have been put somewhere by a society that does not quite know what to do with them, who maintain their dignity and their specific personalities within the constraints of institutional care, who have private inner lives that the institution does not address, and the show glimpses in the background of the scenes it sets there. The consistency of these background retirement castle residents across multiple episodes is the show's quiet argument that these people have lives, that the people who live in such places are not furniture, that their stories did not end when their children stopped having time to maintain them at home. The show does not preach this. It simply maintains the same faces in the same institution across years of episodes, treating their continuing presence as something that matters. The Springfield Church congregation is another consistent minor character world. The same faces appear in the pews every Sunday. They have their specific positions in the church's social geography. The prominent families near the front, the less prominent ones toward the back, The specific individual who always falls asleep during the sermon, and the specific individual who is always slightly too enthusiastic about the hymns. This congregation has been attending this church for 36 years in the show's background, and they have been drawn with enough consistency that the viewer who pays attention to the pews, rather than the pulpit, can track the same people across decades of Sunday services. There is something moving about this, when you think about it. The show has given this background congregation a continuous life across its entire run. They were there for Reverend Lovejoy's early sermons, and they are there for his later ones. They have heard the same range of theological messages, the same gradations of pastoral enthusiasm, the same Sunday morning rhythms of a religious community that is doing what religious communities do, gathering, practicing, maintaining the social bonds that the gathering and the practicing produce. And all of this happens in the background, in the 5 seconds that any given Simpsons scene spends in the church before moving on to wherever the story is actually going. The show's treatment of scale and proportion in background characters is a design choice that has been telling a story about Springfield's social ecology throughout the show's run. Mr. Burns is drawn with proportions that emphasize his extreme thinness, his slight stoop, the specific frailty of a very old body that is still, somehow, exerting enormous force on the world around it. He looks like someone who should not be able to do what he does. The visual design makes this explicit. Here is a man whose body suggests ending, whose authority should have been surrendered years ago to the laws of biology, and yet his presence in any scene he enters is dominant. The visual discrepancy between his physical fragility and his social power is the design team's argument about what power actually is. Power is not physical strength. Power is accumulated infrastructure. And Burns's physical fragility, his almost translucent quality in certain lighting conditions, is the honest visual statement of that argument. Ned Flanders is drawn with proportions that suggest vitality and good stewardship of a body. He is maintained. He has been specifically drawn as someone who cares about his physical self in a way that Homer, for instance, does not. This design choice is part of the show's visual argument about Ned's character. He is a person who takes care of what is in his care, including himself. And the visual contrast between Ned's maintained proportions and Homer's more indulgent ones is the show making a statement about the specific way in which Homer and Ned represent different approaches to the question of self-maintenance without any dialogue needed. The specific way that characters' expressions change between scenes in the brief transitional moments when the show cuts from one location to another and a character appears in both is a continuity detail that the show maintains with unusual precision in peak seasons. The emotional state that a character is in at the end of one scene carries into the beginning of the next. This seems obvious, but it is surprisingly difficult to maintain in animation, where each scene is produced separately and the emotional continuity between scenes has to be actively managed rather than naturally preserved. The early Simpsons is particularly careful about this. The character you see at the end of a kitchen scene is carrying the same private emotional state into the living room. The transition is not a reset. The person continues being the person they were being in the previous scene. This emotional continuity across scenes is part of what makes the peak seasons of the show feel, to viewers who have absorbed them without quite analyzing the feeling, like they are watching real people rather than animated characters. Real people carry their emotional states through space. They do not reset between rooms. The Simpson family, in the scenes where the animation is at its most careful, carries their emotional states through the cuts, and this produces a specific quality of domestic realism that the show has always understood is one of its core strengths. The color choices for characters' clothing across episodes are also a design system that the show maintains with unusual consistency. Main characters wear the same clothes in almost every episode: Homer's white shirt and gray pants, Marge's red dress, Bart's red shirt and blue shorts, Lisa's red dress, Maggie's blue sleeper. This is a practical decision for an animated series, since consistent character design makes production more efficient. But it is also a visual argument about the characters' relationships with their own presentation. These are people who have found their look and maintained it. Their clothing is not an expression of daily variation or fashion responsiveness. It is an identity, worn consistently, as steady as everything else about them. The background characters, by contrast, often wear different things in different episodes, which is another layer of the show's visual argument about the difference between main characters and background characters. The Simpson family exists in a kind of temporal stasis, same clothes, same ages, same house. The background characters live in a more ordinary relationship with time, changing their clothes the way people in the real world change their clothes, marking the passage of time through the variation in what they wear, being in this sense more human than the permanently yellow-shirted main characters who never change. The accumulated detail of Springfield is also, when you have spent enough time with it, a portrait of a specific moment in American cultural history, the decades during which The Simpsons has been running. Springfield is not a timeless cartoon town, despite all the evidence of its frozen timeline. It is a town that is always living in the present, always reflecting the cultural context of the episodes being made, always absorbing the anxieties and the humor and the specific obsessions of the years it is passing through. The details in the background track this. The technology that appears in Springfield kitchens and offices and storefronts has changed across 36 years in ways that mirror the actual technological transformation of American domestic life. The references on the newspaper headlines have shifted. The advertising on the billboards reflects different eras of consumer culture. The music in the background episodes has absorbed 36 years of musical evolution. Springfield has been frozen in its characters' ages while being entirely responsive to the world outside its own frame. This is the show's relationship with time stated visually. The story is frozen, but the background moves. The characters do not age, but the world around them is always contemporary, always located in the specific cultural moment of its production. Springfield exists in a permanent present tense, but the present keeps being different, and the background details keep reflecting that difference, while the foreground story maintains its eternal sameness. This paradox, frozen characters in a world that keeps changing, is the visual equivalent of what the show is saying thematically. The Simpsons is a show about the permanence of family love in a world of constant change. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie do not change, because what they represent, the family, the unit, the specific bonds that these particular people have built across their specific history is permanent. It does not update. It does not require a new version. It is the thing that remains constant while everything around it changes. And the background details, the changing technology, the evolving cultural references, the shifting aesthetic of Springfield's commercial environment are the changing world pressing against the permanent story. The background is time moving. The foreground is the thing that does not move. And the show holds both of these things in the same frame, 36 seasons worth of episodes. The permanent and the changing existing simultaneously, each one making the other more visible. This is, finally, what the background of The Simpsons is for. Not just comedy, not just verisimilitude, not just the professional pride of a production team that cares about the quality of its work. The background is the passage of time made visible in a show that cannot allow its foreground characters to age. It is the world flowing past while the family stays still. It is the proof that the world outside Evergreen Terrace keeps moving, keeps changing, keeps generating new headlines, and new signs, and new billboard advertisements, and new musical references, and that none of it changes the family on the couch. The family is the constant. The background is everything that is not constant. And the show has been holding these two things together, in the same frame, for 36 years, trusting that some viewers would eventually look from one to the other and understand what they were seeing. You have been looking tonight. You have seen both. The family on the couch and the world flowing past them. The story that does not change, and the background that always does. Springfield, which is everywhere and nowhere, permanent and always updating, a dream and a document, a cartoon and a diagnosis, a joke and the truth beneath the joke. Sleep well. You know where to look for it now. Section 12. The final hidden secret, what Springfield was always really about. There is a question that has been sitting underneath everything we have looked at tonight. Visible in the way that the newspaper headlines were visible if you knew to look, if you paused at the right moment, if you let your attention drift from the foreground to the background where the real information lies. The question is this: why does it matter? Not rhetorically, genuinely. Why does it matter that the animators drew real-looking student artwork on the bulletin boards of Springfield Elementary? Why does it matter that the signs in Springfield's commercial district contain wordplay that passes in under a second? Why does it matter that the background characters and crowd scenes have specific, maintained expressions and consistent presences across multiple seasons? Why does it matter that the music is commenting rather than merely accompanying? Why does it matter, given that it is all in service of a cartoon comedy about a fictional family in a fictional town that is not even consistently located in any real state? The answer, when you have spent enough time in the background of Springfield, becomes clear in the way that things become clear after long attention, not as a revelation, more as a recognition, something you already knew becoming legible. The details matter because they are the proof that someone was paying attention, not to the audience necessarily. Or not only to the audience, the details in the background of The Simpsons, the specific headlines, the specific signs, the specific faces in the crowd, the specific music choices, the specific color palettes. These are the residue of a specific quality of attention that the people making the show brought to their work. They are the evidence of a production culture that could not, even under the considerable pressures of commercial television production, bring itself to leave the background empty. This is rarer than it sounds. Television is a high-output medium. The economics of television production do not reward spending time on details that most viewers will never notice. Every hour spent getting a background sign right is an hour that could have been spent on something that more people will see. The rational production decision, made purely from a commercial standpoint, is to cut the corner, to use a generic background, to put a blank wall where a specific wall would require another hour of work. The Simpsons did not do this. For 36 years, it has not done this. The corners are not cut. The walls have things on them. The newspapers have headlines. The background characters have expressions that have been thought about. The music is choosing to say something specific about the scene it is playing under. This represents a quantity of unrequired effort so large, accumulated across 36 years of production, that it constitutes its own kind of statement. It is the production team saying, with every unread sign and every background face and every musical cue that nobody consciously registered, we were here, we were paying attention. We cared about this even in the parts that nobody would see. And that quality of attention, that presence in the background, that care extended to the parts of the work that are not visible to most of the audience, is what the show has been asking its viewers to reciprocate all along. Not through elaborate effort, not through scholarly analysis, just by sometimes looking at the background, by sometimes letting the foreground continue without your full attention while your eye drifts to the wall behind the characters, the street outside the window, the expression on the face of the person who is not talking. Springfield has been calling to the viewers who pay that kind of attention since the beginning. Not loudly, not obviously, in the way that a background calls to you quietly, patiently, in the register of things that are present without insisting on being noticed. And the viewers who heard that call, who let their eyes drift from Homer to the sign on the wall behind him, who paused on the newspaper headline, who followed the background character's arc across a crowd scene, those viewers got a different show than the viewers who watched only the foreground. Not a better show, necessarily. The foreground of The Simpsons is one of the great achievements of comedy writing in the history of the medium. It does not need the background to justify itself. But the background adds something that the foreground cannot provide. It adds the specific kind of reality that comes from depth, from the sense that beyond the story you are watching, there is more story, and beyond that story there is even more. And the world of Springfield extends in all directions beyond any individual frame, populated by people and objects and sounds and details that the camera cannot capture all at once and can never quite exhaust. This is what distinguishes a world from a setting. A setting is a backdrop. A world is something that exists whether you are looking at it or not. Springfield is a world. It exists in its background details even when the foreground story is not touching them. It is running continuously, generating its own details, maintaining its own internal life, in the specific and particular way that a place maintains itself when it is inhabited by people who care about it. The writers and animators who built Springfield over 36 years were those people. They were the ones who cared about the town they were building, even the parts of the town that the camera would never directly address. They gave the town a history, visible in the weathering of its buildings. They gave it a present tense audible in the specific ambient sounds of each location. They gave it a population of people whose inner lives you can read in the background of crowd scenes if you look at the right face at the right moment. They built a world. And the final hidden secret of The Simpsons, the thing that is in the background of every episode but never said directly in any of them, is that the people who made it loved it. Not in the abstract sense in which professionals love their work when the work is going well. In the specific, detailed, corner-not-cut, bulletin board carefully rendered, background character expression thought about sense. They loved this town. They loved its residents, named and unnamed, foreground and background. They loved the Simpsons family in the way that you can only love fictional people after you have spent 36 years thinking about what they would do in every conceivable situation. That love is what the background details are made of. They are not contractual. Nobody required the Simpsons production team to put real headlines on the kitchen table newspaper. Nobody required them to give the background couple a consistent fight across multiple seasons. Nobody required them to choose classical music pieces whose cultural weight comments precisely on the scene playing under them. They did these things because they were in the habit of caring, and the habit of caring extended, naturally and without effort, to the parts of the show that nobody would audit. You can feel this love when you watch the show with attention. It is in the texture of the background. It is in the consistency of the details across decades of production. It is in the specific way that the town of Springfield feels like a real place. Not a real place in the geographic sense, not in the physical or legal sense, but real in the sense that matters more. The sense of having been genuinely imagined by people who cared about what they were imagining. Springfield exists. Not on any map, not in any state, not in any physical location that you could drive to, but in the background of 36 years of episodes, in the details that nobody was required to get right, in the newspaper headlines and the crowd faces, and the building weathering, and the music choices, and the sign wordplay, Springfield is fully present, fully inhabited. A world that continues to exist in the background whether the foreground is currently attending to it or not. And the final thing to understand about the background of The Simpsons is that it is there right now, in whatever episode is currently running, in whatever season came after you stopped watching, in the new episodes that the show keeps producing, season after season, decade after decade, long past the point where anyone expected it to still be running. The background keeps being filled. The signs keep being written. The background characters keep being given their specific faces and expressions and consistent presences. The music keeps making its specific choices. The newspapers keep getting headlines. The bulletin boards keep getting bulletin board art drawn in the specific way that elementary school children actually draw things. The show is doing this right now. It will be doing it in the next episode, and the one after that, and the one after that. The foreground story will belong to Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie, the way it always has, the way it always will. And the background will be full of things that most viewers will not notice, details that nobody required, care that nobody specifically asked for. The quiet, continuous, background-level love of a production team for the world they have been building since 1989, extended, as it always has been, to the parts of the work that most people will never look at. But you look tonight. You have been in the background for several hours now, where the real stories live, where the details accumulate into portraits and the portraits accumulate into something that the foreground can only gesture toward. You looked at the walls and the windows and the newspapers and the faces and the signs. You listened to the music beneath the music. You were in Springfield, the way Springfield was designed to be experienced by the viewer who could not stop looking. And that viewer, the one in the background of the audience, watching the background of the show, is the viewer the production team has been making all of this for 36 years, without knowing you would arrive, trusting that eventually you would. You arrive tonight. Sleep well. Springfield will be there when you wake up. The background will be there too. It always is. That is the whole point. Thank you for spending this time in Springfield. If there is a background detail you have always noticed but never been able to explain, or a moment you are going to go back and look for in an episode you have already seen, drop it in the comments. And if nights like this, slow and careful and full of things most people walk past, are the kind of nights you want more of, subscribe. The background of Springfield is bottomless. We have barely started. Good night.